just start by imagining that you're at the airport. So you're in the airport, airplane's about to take off, you board the airplane, it takes off, and you look out over the community below. So your view might kind of look something like this, where you have a warehouse district and then maybe residential off in the distance. Um, there's a lot of flat and open rooftops in commercial solar. And what is peculiar is that you are more likely to see a solar array on a residential roof or maybe out in the field as a utility scale array rather than to see solar on one of these empty roofs. In fact, if you are at the airport and you take off and you do see a rooftop commercial solar array somewhere, usually that means you're in a state that has heavily subsidized the solar industry at the local level. And so it would be unusual for you to be seeing these commercial arrays compared to the average American. So today we're going to talk about specifically what we can do with these empty commercial rooftops and why I feel they're the most disruptive solar market segment in the USA today. And I actually think they're so disruptive that they will spark a minor energy crisis at some point in the maybe not near future, but 5 or 6 years from now. It will be the commercial solar market segment that is the tipping point that starts pushing utilities into insolvency and cause consolidation to occur in the industry. The flip side of that is that it is one of the most lucrative solar paybacks in the industry today. And so to kind of understand how we went from the smallest, less underutilized, underexploited, ignored market segment in the solar industry today to something that could be a critically disruptive force in the future. How do we get to there? That's what we're going to talk about today. So first, we need to take a step backwards a minute and review a few basic assumptions about solar power to kind of understand how the industry has gotten the commercial rooftop market wrong up to this point, which I know can be kind of a controversial statement to make. But what I do is I back up these claims based on market share. And so, actually, this is my first time through the presentation, so let me the slides, I might have to flip back and forth a minute. But first, let's look at economies of scale. And so economies of scale, many solar industry professionals, energy policy wonks, assume that utility scale solar is better than rooftop solar because of economies of scale. So, in other words, as the projects get larger, they come down in price. And what I think is particularly interesting about solar economies of scale is it's not really like the solar panel itself is getting any cheaper. The hard cost of the panel to a residential customer, they may pay a little bit of supply chain markup through a distributor, but it's a very narrow, kind of squeezed, thin supply chain. And so, especially if you're like I do, I go bargain bin jumping when I buy modules. I'm typically buying solar panels in the 44 cent a watt or less range, and utility scale projects are buying their panels, in the 35 cent a watt range or so. There's not much price difference between buying a pallet of solar panels and buying 10,000 pallets of solar panels. The inverter costs do go down as you get larger. The structural costs do go down. The electrical balance of system costs do go down. So there are some real material savings to be had when you scale up the project compared to, say, residential. But by far and away, the number one cost that is reduced is soft cost. So we talk about that in other classes. Really what I wanted to say about economies of scale is, if projects, as they get larger, they get cheaper. The savings are in soft costs. The larger the project, the smaller the percentage of soft costs are for the project. If you did a utility scale project at residential pricing, a couple of people would become millionaires off that one project. That's not how it works in the utility scale sector. They operate at smaller profit margins than residential. Really, what I wanted to say is, if economies of scale are a benefit to the utility scale segment, if it's a competitive advantage compared to residential, and that makes utility scale better than residential, well, commercial projects should also have that economies of scale advantage. Not quite as much as utility scale, but close to it. The commercial project costs are closer to the utility scale segment than they are to the residential segment, and that is because they've reduced those soft costs like overhead, and also the material costs really haven't gone down all that much comparably. So basically, if economies of scale makes utility scale solar so great, then economies of scale should also make commercial solar so great. Well, to counter economies of scale, we also have the residential market. And the residential market is called, there's a few ways it's referred to. It's called a behind the meter market. And so it's also called consumer owned solar, rooftop solar, sometimes called on-site solar. Behind the meter generation allows the solar array to compete with the retail price of electricity, at least in theory. In contrast, utility scale solar generates closer to its wholesale value, something near the commodity cost of fossil fuels. And then when you generate its electricity, it still needs to be distributed and transmitted. So most utility scale plants are generating at a generation rate that is less than half of retail price electricity. And because retail price, it's inherently higher than wholesale. A wholesale behind the meter solar array should generate at a higher value per unit of energy delivered than a in front of the meter kind of utility scale job site. So utility scale is wholesale, near avoided cost. Behind the meter should be closer to retail at a higher generation value. And it's that near retail generation rate that makes the higher price of residential solar still be reasonably competitive. It can cost twice as much to build a residential array per watt because the generation rate is twice as high. In short, well, what that implies is that the commercial segment is unique, and that it can benefit from the economies of scale of utility scale, but also benefit from behind the meter generation like residential. And back to this original chart, what is so peculiar about that is, if you have economies of scale and behind the meter generation, you have the best of all worlds and should be the number one market segment in the U.S. solar industry. And in fact, historically, that was the case. Back in the Stone Age before solar, in the early 2000s, these refineries were just getting off the out of the ground, it was largely a residential, remote, off-grid luxury market. But as soon as the mid 2000s came and silicon production began to scale up, the commercial market quickly eclipsed within like a 2008 to 2010 period. It became the largest market segment in the solar industry. A lot of that had to do with commercial solar incentives being created. But by and large, it was because, hey, finally, solar is not just a luxury residential purchase, but when you add up all the incentives and look at the declining costs, it's something that a businessman could invest in and invest in heavily. And so we saw these commercial solar arrays come out of the ground. Um, what happened at the end of 2006, at the end of 2008, is the federal tax credit came to market. And in the past, the tax credit was capped at a $2,000 upper limit. And what was unique about 2008 is the 30% tax credit was uncapped. And what that meant is, Merrill Lynch or Morgan Stanley can go build a $1 billion solar farm and get a 30% tax credit on that, a $300 million tax credit in exchange for the $1 billion solar farm. And so, that's a lot more simple than doing a whole bunch of commercial arrays. So, in one sense, the federal tax credit kind of stole some of the headwind that the commercial industry was experiencing at the time, and your large institutional investors said, "Hey, look, we'll invest in." Some of them went into residential solar leasing. Most of the money went into utility scale projects, and what we saw as a result of, say, the tax credit was the market shifted away from consumer-owned solar and rooftop solar and distributed solar in general, and instead started to support utility scale installations. And the proof is in the pudding. This big leap in utility scale projects was all booked around the assumption that the tax credit would end in 2016. It later got extended, but we see the lopsided impact of this tax credit subsidy and how it drives the utility scale market. And so, that directly took, expertise and financing and financial attractiveness away from the commercial sector. Now, the residential sector continued to pick up. So this isn't the entire story. What we saw is growth in the utility scale sector, but we also saw growth in the residential sector, and the commercial market along this time is remaining rather stagnant. And so from 2010, we see commercial solar going from the largest market segment in the industry to, by the time 2014 rolls around, it's the smallest. And that's where it remains today. So the commercial market segment, no one's debating that it's the smallest market segment in the industry. So there's a little bit more going on in this debate. One reason why residential growth remains so robust is the discussion of net metering. So net metering is the discussion of how a solar array owner should be compensated for electrical outflow onto the grid. Utilities feel that the compulsory purchase of solar outflow should not be any more than their avoided cost of fuel operation. So something that is below retail, something that is more than 50% below retail, the avoided cost of fuel is generally around 20% of retail value. And so utilities right off the bat feel that solar outflow, is only worth it should be an 80% discount the minute that it leaves your property. as far as the residential rate structure goes. And residential customers said, no, there's other merits of discussion here, and we're not trying to be power producers. We're just trying to reduce our own electric bill. Well, here's the problem with that. Most residential customers want to offset 100% of their electric bill, but the sun only works during the day, as we know, and so let's just call it 1/3 of the day the solar array is on, and then 2/3 of the day the solar array is off. And so while the solar array is on to produce a 100% offset, 2/3 of the array production has to go either directly into the grid or into a battery. And so that's a rather substantial amount of the array production that needs to go somewhere that is not consumed on site. And so consumers sought out net metering protections in order to entitle them to a higher compensation rate for that outflow onto the grid. Otherwise, they felt solar would not really work, the economic opportunity wouldn't be there, and batteries are expensive. The consumers do have a point, though, because in most cases the energy is simply resold to their next door neighbor the instant it outflows onto the electric grid, and it does have other benefits. I got into the solar industry in 2008, and back then we would discuss the merits of solar's peak energy benefit, which is true. Demand on the electric grid as a whole is greatest in the middle of the day, in the middle of summer, and solar produces electricity at that time. However, the merits of that argument weaken as we go towards a 100% renewable grid. Most in the solar industry would like to see an electric grid that is approaching 100% renewable at the very least. And if that's what you want, well, there'll be so much solar on the grid that midday sunny weather is no longer peak energy. So the merit of the argument for peak energy, it may make sense today, but it really won't make sense tomorrow. And we'll still have this discussion over, where does that 2/3 of power go? Net metering discussions really kicked off in 2005 with the Federal Energy Policy Act. And it's based around 100% offset. It used to be that net metering wasn't an issue because instead of having digital meters, we'd have analog meters. The analog meters inherently had net metering built into them, where the meter would just spin backwards or spin forwards. So in a sense, the digital meters have spurred the debate in net metering, because now the outflow versus inflow can be separately tracked and compensated separately. It's kind of interesting. Net metering, I think it might be the most cost-effective way for society to transition to a 100% renewable grid, but even so, like all subsidies, net metering has played a role in shaping the solar market that might distract us from solar's most cost-effective, unsubsidized applications. And net metering does not always solve the problems regarding with solar outflow. And in times, the net metering policies can actually work against the consumer because it invites the power provider to come in and define, exactly what their net metering policy is. In Mississippi, some utilities have used the state net metering policy to actually push additional costs onto solar customers via solar discriminatory rate structuring. And so net metering is not like the golden goose that everyone in the solar industry should really be rallying behind to protect. But this is kind of the fundamental problem in Mississippi For example, we have high electric bills, reasonably high electric rates, but our net metering policy is essentially to have no net metering, and the buyback onto the grid is only worth avoided cost, whereas the retail value of that electricity is substantially higher than that. And so by wrecking the buyback rate of solar, the cooperative or power operator can kind of slow the growth of solar in the area. That used to really upset me. At the same time, the utilities that kind of push back the most on solar generally have the fewest customers per mile of power line, and so they're the most exposed to revenue drop, and they don't want people generating their own electricity on site because of that. The irony being, in rural areas, distributed generation makes the most amount of sense, and the cooperatives that are supposed to add value to their members are kind of discriminating against the distributed clean energy. That's really another topic for another day in another class. The reason I mention it in this class is that net metering makes very little difference to the feasibility of a commercial solar peaker. And so you might find that you're living in a state like Mississippi that has a terrible net metering policy, and everyone says, oh, the solar market doesn't exist because there's no net metering here. And you might be, right down the road, there might be a commercial solar project that would be quite valuable to both you and the client, more than what a residential solar array would be to even a average American in a better, with better solar policy. In fact, the arguments over net metering are kind of net metering is on the ropes, really. Here we have is a TVA rate structure for 2018 where they specifically call out distributed energy as being unfair to non-distributed energy customers. The basic argument is that in the TVA region, they already have enough power capacity to meet everybody's needs in a declining population, so they don't need all the wealthiest people in the area to install solar and stop paying their electric bills. And so they're raising prices on customers who want to generate their own electricity, which effectively in my area forces those customers to consider off-grid options. So reliance on net metering is not necessarily a good thing. These net metering provisions almost uniformly have upper limits that are easily approachable. When your state is 1% solar, 2% solar, 4% solar, if you do have net metering protections, they'll go away. And, again, if our goal is to try to get up to a 100% renewable grid, or in my case, I want to see a 100% solar grid with all the other technologies, playing very small second fiddles, we're going to blow through those net metering limits, and all this talk over net metering will really, historically look a little bit silly, especially as batteries kind of allow you the luxury of storing that electricity on site. But again, the takeaway is net metering is not important to commercial facilities for a couple of reasons. The main one is you might not have outflow on a commercial facility. You might have a large facility, and the solar array just reduces its on-site consumption, and so outflow buyback doesn't matter. But that's not the whole story either. So what we see in the growth rates of solar over the past few years is utility scale has really shot up. Residential has grown. it's leveled off a little bit as a result of import tariffs. I actually think this is a 2018 estimate. I actually think we did grow this year. I think the impact of the import tariff was less than what installers thought it would be. But I know I installed more solar in 2018 than 2017. But anyway, utility grows, residential grows, and what we see is utility is growing because of the tax credit. Before the solar tax credit, the utility scale market was less than 10% of the market. Now it is the majority of the market. The single difference being the tax credit. The tax credit attracted institutional investors looking for utility-sized projects to invest in, and they didn't have to give the attention to the commercial market. At the same time, all of the consumer-owned rooftop solar policy is focused on protecting the consumer, and those net metering policies did a really good job at protecting the residential consumer where it does exist. But inherently, net metering does not lend itself well to a commercial rate structure because they're billed differently for their electricity. We talk about this in kind of more introductory classes, so I want to spend more time on the detail for this one. But here's an example of a demand charge. We're going to come back to it in the design example. But what we see is this customer has a $4,000 electric bill. And if I opened up my electric bill and it was $4,000, I'd think, oh my goodness, I used a ton of electricity. How much electricity did I leave the air conditioner on and the windows open and my electric water heater on and just like blew it out of the park? How much energy did I use? Well, a commercial electric bill is divided into two parts, energy and power. And so we see here a separate charge for kilowatts and then a separate charge for kilowatt hours. And, I don't want to insult the intelligence of many in the room who I know this already, but you just think about it on a graph. We have one axis that's kilowatts and another axis that's kilowatt hours. And so what that means is that the kind of the volume under this curve here is kilowatt hours. So the area under this curve is kilowatt hours, and the maximum height of the curve is measured in kilowatts. And so a residential electric bill, more often than not, is based on just the total area under the curve, kilowatt hours, whereas what we see in most common electric rate structures is they actually have two separate charges, one for kilowatts, the height of the curve, and one for kilowatt hours, the area under the curve. And what's interesting about that is you could be in a market where residentially you pay 12 cents a kilowatt hour for your electricity, and your business next door could be averaging 12 cents a kilowatt hour for their electricity, but how they got to that point was a completely different calculation. And so you can get rate structures where the commercial business may only pay 6 cents for their energy and have one demand structure. Or they might pay 3 cents for their energy and have an even higher demand rate and average out to 12 cents. And so, if you are living in a market where the price of electricity is cheap, and you think, oh, there's no solar industry because in my area the price of electricity is cheap, you still might get a commercial facility that has a low energy charge and a high demand charge. Basically, it might be that the energy sold to that customer is being sold at cost, and all of the utility revenue is coming from the demand charge. So that's kind of what we're going to explore, is in what regions are solar peakers, profitable, and does that mean that there might actually be a growth opportunity in markets that have not had access to solar before because of the lack of net metering? So basically, the commercial electric bill is divided into two parts. And even if net metering did apply to this bill, it would only apply to the energy portion of it, which in this case is like a penny a kilowatt hour. In this case, the energy is almost worthless. So even if the commercial facility had net metering and the array qualified for net metering, the outflow onto the grid at a net metered protected rate would still be almost worthless. The net metered credit for energy that only costs a penny is only a penny. And so by changing all of the electric bills from energy charges to demand charges, a utility could counteract the value of net metering. In fact, that's part of where the debate is on solar rate structuring. I'll give you net metering, but you have to go on to a different rate. Is that really net metering compliance or not? And again, I hate all that because batteries are going to make that moot anyway. Basically the utility is going to charge what they're going to charge, and as an installer, you kind of got to run around all that. And so, because maybe only half the bill are so the compensation for net metering for a commercial customer, if any, is no more than half of what a residential customer would get for the same kilowatt hour outflowed onto the grid. And that's why, commercial solar has not received that, or that's one of the reasons why commercial solar has not received the same behind the meter generation rate, generation value that residential has gotten, is because solar has only done stuff to reduce energy charges and not enough to reduce demand charges. So a solar array at a penny a kilowatt hour, well, that'll never make sense. Even at the utility scale level, it'll have to be 200 years before we get to the point where clean renewable energy is costs less than that. So let's, if we know that the demand charge is where maybe utilities could hide rate structures to mitigate the effects of net metering, at the very least, we know that demand rate structures have strangled the commercial market. And we know it's the rate structure because of the growth rates in other markets. Residential has grown. They have not had that same demand rate structure as commercial. They've had net metering protections. They grow. Utility scale, for that matter. A utility scale power purchase agreement is subject to negotiation, and usually it comes in at maybe 40% the retail value of electricity, let's just say. Well, avoided cost is closer to 20%. And so you might find yourself in a situation where a commercial solar array outflowing to the grid at point of use is only getting 2 cents a kilowatt hour compensation, whereas a utility scale solar array has been able to strike a better deal with the utility and actually gets a higher buyback rate, even though that electricity still has to be distributed and transmitted to the local grid. And so maybe there's a little bit more flexibility for these developers to go in and work with utilities to get large projects done at the utility scale. And they've also been stymied by that commercial rate structure for developing the commercial market. And so it with a very heavy hand, we can come down and say demand rate structures have been bad for solar historically, and that is why the commercial market segment is so repressed. So the other half of the commercial electric bill, not the energy portion, but the demand portion. You get this data from your utility or from your online account. It's called interval data, and it can be downloaded in your online account. So here's a picture of facility interval data, which we've graphed to produce. It's like a 15 minute by 15 minute by 15 minute data set. We'll take a look at it in a little bit when we actually go through and build this kind of a model. Um, not all commercial rate structures. Let me go back to a wider load profile for a minute. Not all rate structures are just as basic as demand plus the area under the curve or demand plus energy. Some rate structures will kind of a more funky one breaks it into kind of a volumetric rate structure where you buy this much energy at this much demand, and then this much energy for that much demand, and then this much energy for that much demand. And they kind of make it a rectangular volumetric rate structure. Other industrial facilities may actually get a real-time energy price rate structure that will actually vary the price based on what the spot price of electricity is throughout the day. And so basically what you have with utility rate structures are something where they're trying to approach more of something closer to real-time electricity pricing. And so by not just quantifying how much consumption you're consuming, but also quantifying your demand and maybe anything that they do to give it higher resolution, whether it's time of day metering, where you have a higher rate in the middle of the day and a lower rate at night, or off-peak and peak kilowatt hour levels, or volumetric rate structuring that is more complicated. It's all about trying to create a billing structure that has the same kind of resolution as real-time electricity pricing, so that the price of electricity and the customer bill is a better match. Perhaps the problem is maybe the demand rate structure is a little bit too simple because it's only based off your maximum 15-minute peak for the entire month. So we'll see an example where a facility in July is normally operating a 15 kilowatt load, but all of a sudden, one 15-minute interval in the middle of July, their load spikes up to 50 kilowatts, and they're stuck with a 50 kilowatt demand charge, even though their average load throughout the month was 15 and 50 sound too similar. Their average load was 20 kilowatts. For one 15-minute period, they spike up to 50. That doesn't matter. You're paying as if you had a 50 kilowatt hour load. Another thing that is a little bit more of an advanced topic, but I'm sure there's some advanced students in the audience today. Another way to think about it is all this empty space under the curb. When you're already paying that high demand charge, all this empty space is basically free electricity, or electricity that could be used at avoided cost. So last year when Bitcoin mining was getting hot, that was something that was interesting, is where do you access dirt cheap electricity? Well, a lot of these commercial facilities have access to dirt cheap electricity because most of their bill is in that demand charge level. So this is the building interval data. Sometimes it's divided into 15-minute periods. Sometimes it's divided into 30-minute periods. It depends on the utility. Um, so, at the very least, we can conclude that the value of solar is not being reflected in commercial rate structures. Most facility energy usage is going to look like this shape, where maximum demand is occurring in the middle of the day. By adding solar to the facility, we are reducing that facility's peak demand. And so, it is having quite an effect. The problem is one cloud comes and turns off the array for a minute, your building demand will then spike up to where it was before, and now you have a big, giant, tall, skinny rectangle in the middle of your load profile, and you didn't get any demand savings for that month. And so in this case, even though quite evidently solar is reducing the building's peak energy usage, they're only getting compensated at maybe a penny a kilowatt hour for all of this production. In order to make the savings real, they have to be able to do something about that peak demand. But both the solar tax credit, and we'll see how the solar tax credit benefits these projects in a little bit, and it's not perhaps the most noble of benefits. Effectively, it only takes a small solar array to charge a solar peaker. So by adding a small solar array, you qualify the project for a 30% tax credit. The solar array costs less than 30% of the total project cost. So it's almost like you get a free solar array whenever you install one of these things. Now, that's not the most noble reason. There are other benefits that solar will provide. For example, if you are a facility that has its maximum load in the summertime, solar is reducing that peak load. It's not the battery. The battery is just playing free safety. Then again, it's surprising how many commercial loads look closer to something like this, where there's a big spike at the beginning of the day when all the motors and equipment, computers and air conditioners are all turning on at the same time. And to some extent, you might be able to use digital controls to spread out that surge. On the other hand, the business day starts at 8 and ends at 5, so there are some physical realities of just natural human, we use a lot of energy in the morning to cause a early morning surge, maybe when the solar array is not up. And so where that comes in is maybe the solar array doesn't have to be very big. Maybe the solar array doesn't have to do 100% of the facility load. The tax credit and net metering are both policies that encourage doing the largest solar project that you possibly can. It's 30% no matter the cost. Might as well get the Mercedes instead of the Honda because it's 30% off. Won't have that opportunity in the future. And so the tax credit, it'll front load project costs. It'll have you buy a little bit more premium products. We'll see that later that the California market is kind of split between low-end and high-end lithium-ion batteries. And it's hard to determine which is better because they subsidize their battery market. And so you can go further into that top shelf product since you're not paying for it anyway. I know that's not you're welcome to disagree with that, but there's also, these are real projects with real programs. But the tax credit and net metering, by and large, are phasing out. The tax credit is sunsetting. This is the last year for 30%. It's going to decline and then ultimately phase out in 2023. Net metering, in some states it's being protected, in most states it's being scaled back or redefined to be watered down. But batteries are coming to the market, and that's shaking things up. The good news is that batteries will give the customer an alternate to grid connection. So I've had customers say, I'm going off grid because the solar policy in Mississippi is so terrible, there's no incentive for me to remain grid connected. Well, okay. The bad news, though, is that batteries are expensive. And so if you're designing an off grid house, you need 1/3 of the time you're running off solar, but 2/3 of the time you're running off batteries. And so you need a battery bank that can support at least 2/3, if not a day's worth or 2 days worth or 3 days worth of energy to live in an off grid home. So whereas with the off-grid residential market, you're trying to generate and store 100% of a home's energy use, a commercial solar peaker can be laser focused on reducing just the tip of the facility energy use. And so it might be that the solar array during the day generates power, but that power is not 100% of the facility power. It may only be 10% of the facility power. But because we take that 10% and then we store it in the battery, well, for one, we get the tax credit. We could be charging the battery without solar. This facility really doesn't benefit from solar. If we get rid of the subsidy discussion, this facility, their peak is occurring in the morning, so they don't really need solar to charge it. They could charge their battery from the grid and still do some load leveling. So that is something we consider when designing solar peakers is, what is the right size of the solar array to actually have benefit to the project. But the point is, you're no longer trying to generate or store 100% of a facility energy with a solar peaker. You might only be trying to store or generate 10% of the facility energy use. But because you're deploying that energy at peak times, generating 10% of your energy on site might reduce your electric bill by 30% or even more. Depending on the shape of your load profile, you may have the very best solar payback in the industry, certainly the best unsubsidized payback in the industry. When you think about it, residential net metering is focused on a kind of we'll talk about these examples in a minute. So residential net metering is focused on a 1-to-1 parity for solar compensation. Solar outflows onto the grid, and the customer gets a retail credit for that outflow under the most generous of net metering programs. So 1 kilowatt hour goes out, and you get 1 kilowatt hour credit, and ideally that's worth retail value. Sometimes it's worth less than retail value. But with a solar peaker, there is no outflow onto the grid. And on top of that, thinking back to, well, if I'm generating 10% of a facility's energy use and I'm reducing the bill by 30%, what that actually means is that in a solar peaker, the value of the system is generating electricity that is worth substantially above the retail value of electricity. And so, by having our system just generate this most valuable spike in energy, and that's it. We're not going for the costlier base load. If we just go and laser focus in on the very peak loads, you can achieve a generation rate that can be 3 or 4 times higher than the operating cost of the system. So the question becomes, well, how valuable can solar peakers become? And so for that, we need to kind of understand how to design and assess. And so that becomes a good time to do a design example. But basically we have, all of that peak spike represents savings. During the day, the solar array will charge the batteries. The battery will deploy during demand times. And so let's just assume, I think these are pretty reasonable prices. A 350 a watt per watt installed cost. And that really doesn't mean anything to you yet because we haven't gone through how much each line item costs. But even this is kind of reflective of different demand charges and electric rates in my area, where I either get large business customers with $20 demand charges and 3-cent kilowatt hour rates versus larger businesses with 9-cent kilowatt hour rate and a lower demand charge. But what we see is the solar paybacks are much better than they are in the residential sector. So, it really might be a lack of expertise that's holding this market back to say that, hey, look, batteries are expensive and solar has not had a good payback, but we haven't been combining the two together to go after the most valuable electricity to a commercial business. So, what we'll do in our design exercises is kind of figure out, what the designer needs to know to kind of approach that design challenge. So, let's start out with a very popular product so that we're all kind of on home base together, which is the Tesla Powerwall 2. This is not the only time today we'll talk about the Tesla Powerwall 2. But it costs around $10,000 to $15,000 total to be installed. So it's cheaper than that, but then you got to pay the labor and some additional system material. So if you're just installing one Tesla Powerwall 2, I would kind of say $15,000 is more reasonable. But then once you start installing multiple ones, like in a little bit, we'll do a model and we'll basically be assuming a commercial install is going to be doing multiple Tesla Powerwalls. And so we'll kind of switch back over into this $10,000 price range on the low end. So it's a 5 kilowatt output maximum, and they have 2.5 hours of battery capacity in there. And we'll talk about that ratio when we get into our battery chemistry discussion in the afternoon. So just take these things at face value at a $10,000 to $15,000 installation price and a 40,000 kilowatt hour warranty. It comes to a levelized cost of operation of 25 cents to 40 cents per kilowatt hour, plus the electricity cost to charge it. And so Tesla Powerwall is actually quite expensive. No surprise there. We're not all running out to plug batteries into our homes at this time. Tesla Powerwall is expensive. Okay. But on top of that, usually the energy extremes for like time of day or variable rate metering afforded to a residential customer, the differential between off-peak and peak rates is closer to 20 cents or 15 cents rather than 25 to 40 cents. And so the idea of taking an energy-only rate and day trading electricity doesn't really make sense because the cost to run the battery is higher than what you'd save. So you'd just be, even in a break-even proposition, you'd just be unnecessarily spinning your wheels. But to a commercial customer, we have to think back to this demand rate bill. First off, the cost to charge the battery could be very cheap. You don't need a solar array to do it. if you didn't have a solar array, charging this battery would only cost a penny a kilowatt hour. That's nothing. The battery itself costs 25 to 40 cents a kilowatt hour to use, assuming this is a commercial array. Let's go with a low end number of 25 cents. The cost to charge it is 1 cent, no big deal. But what's the value of running the Tesla Powerwall to a commercial customer for 1 hour? And what we'll see is the cost savings are substantially larger than the operating cost of the equipment, and that's what drives the economics of these systems. So, let's take two examples. One is where you're on a $10 a kilowatt demand charge, and the other is where you're on a $20 a kilowatt demand charge. So what we see is either you have a higher energy rate and a lower demand charge, or a higher demand charge and a lower energy rate. Well, the energy rate really doesn't matter. We're just using a small amount of electricity to run this battery. So, in this design case, we're running the solar battery for 4 hours a day. So this would be a Tesla Powerwall that offloads that works in the morning to counter the morning peak load. Maybe it also works in the evening to counter an evening peak load. And it's also only operating 5 days a month. So this is a very small system. And the reason why I say 5 days a month is, you look at your data here. Sure, we're getting our peak load in the morning here, and our peak load in the morning here, and our peak load in the morning here. But if I'm only trying to load level down to this amount, I need a teeny tiny system to do that. That might be a single 5 kilowatt Powerwall. If I tried to load level down substantially deeper, I would need a lot more storage capacity. So it is possible to do just a tiny array and have it only operate a couple of days a month, kind of playing free safety. So this system runs 4 hours a day at 5 days a month at 5 kilowatts of power capacity. So the question is, how much is it going to save the customer a month? Well, the answer is for the at 10 kilowatts, it doesn't really matter how long it runs. The maximum it can save at a 5 kilowatt output is $50. Likewise, if the demand charge was $20 a kilowatt, the savings would be double. It'd be 100. And so let's say this is one Tesla Powerwall, and let's say it was installed. Let's keep the math simple. Let's say it was installed for $10,000, and then it's saving us 5 kilowatt power level. It's operating. We're going to assume that it's operating at its perfect efficiency level. So it actually is achieving us a $50 a month savings. That comes out to be $600 a year, and then just doing the math here, $10,000 divided by 600. You're looking at a 17-year payback at a 10 kilowatt rate. And then on top of that, at a 20 kilowatt rate, the payback would be half that. And so, what is the primary driver of the commercial solar peaker market? Well, it's that demand charge. If you have a high demand charge, you're a great candidate for a commercial solar peaker. If you have a low demand charge, you have a higher energy rate. And so in that case, you might want to do more solar and less battery. But a solar peaker is about identifying an instance where the demand charges are so lopsided that instead of preventing solar from coming to the grid, it creates instead a tremendous opportunity for a solar battery system. So we need to make some assumptions. Now, our first assumption will be that a solar array can produce on a flat roof 1 watt of solar can produce 1.2 kilowatt hours annually. Now, I recommend in all of my classes to know what this production ratio actually is in your area. And we're going to use a software called PV Watts to find that. But we do it in so many other classes, and we're going to be doing it in our design example, that I'm just going to wait for the design example to show you how to determine what this number actually is for your model. But for now, it's the on a residential rooftop, for most, 1 watt of solar will produce 1.3 kilowatt hours, and then you get into sunnier climates and it can go up to that. And so by putting the solar at a lower tilt angle on a flat roof, we're going to be reducing this a little bit. That's what's driving our conservative assumption here. Well, if 1 watt produces 1.2 kilowatt hours a year, 1 kilowatt will produce 1,200 kilowatt hours a year, and so they'll produce 100 kilowatt hours per month on average. Of course, solar production in the winter is less than solar production in the summer, and so what we're going to do is just assume now, and we're not going to make this kind of assumption when we do our model. We'll actually, get closer to something more accurate. But for now, let's just assume that 50 kilowatt hours is available every month to charge the battery, and then the excess value of the remaining electricity is going to be negligible. So we're going to kind of err on the side of conservatism to say, hey, we're only going to model, we're not going to model any energy cost for our battery because the battery is going to be charged with solar. But we're also going to kind of assume that, we're not going to model the cost of energy. And we'll show you why in a little bit. And the answer is because it is so negligible compared to those demand savings that it's really the demand savings are 2 orders of magnitude greater than the energy savings. So there's just no point when you're on an excessive demand rate structure to even consider kind of the energy aspects to it, unless you want to do Bitcoin mining, which is kind of 2018. We're also assuming that we're not trying to do a solar array to overproduce. With solar, historically, you try and kind of do 100% of the bill unless you don't have the budget to do so. Well, in this case, we're saying no. We're only going to do a large enough solar array to make sure that we can charge the battery, to make sure that we can qualify the system for the tax credit. And that way we recoup the money we spend on the solar array. So we're not going to spend too much time on that, at least until we get into our modeling and can get into some better values for the solar as part of the system. But the takeaway is demand charges make energy rates less important. So again, if you have not yet mastered the difference between power and energy, power is your demand charge and power is instantaneous. It's the y-axis. It occurs at one sliver in time. What is my instantaneous power level? What is my maximum instantaneous power level? Whereas energy is power multiplied by time. Power is measured in kilowatts. Energy is measured in kilowatt hours. So we're back to our Tesla Powerwall. What we want to know is, well, how large of a solar array do we need to charge the Tesla Powerwall? And we're going to use our little conservative assumption that 1 watt of solar produces 1.2 kilowatt hours per year, and so that's 1,200 kilowatt hours per month. And so 1 kilowatt of solar will produce 100 kilowatt hours per month on average. We think about half that will be available for the battery to charge. And we need that availability in the winter when we're using our battery to offset those peak, morning loads. So it's not like we don't need that capacity in the winter. We do. So we have to be very conservative on our solar production estimate. The value of that production doesn't matter so much as just the ability to charge the solar array. So we want to do the smallest solar array possible that will charge the battery completely. If you happen to miss your mark and you do not charge the battery with solar, but instead you charge the battery with brown energy, you have to refund a percentage of the tax credit. So you have to track how much you charged with the facility versus your solar array and document it, and then go back and refund whatever percentage, 1%, 2%, 3%. You have to go refund that difference on your taxes because your system's no longer powered by completely renewable. And in fact, there's a minimum threshold of about 80% that you have to meet before it even qualifies. So might as well shoot for 100%. Just do know there is some wiggle room in there. And it might be based on your tax situation or your building load profile that not doing 100% but doing something a little bit less than that is okay. I would design for 100%, and that way if you have a bad year or a huge blizzard and you have to charge the battery with your facility to hit your demand charge reductions, that it's not that big of a deal to do so. But in any case, back to our Tesla Powerwall. We have our Tesla Powerwall 2 installed for $10,000 to $15,000 with a 5 kilowatt output. We're assuming, and this is just an arbitrary made up number for this particular Tesla Powerwall case structure, but I kind of based it on a facility that might have very sharp peaks and us wanting to shave only the tippiest top of the peak off of it. So we're only running this 5 kilowatt array for about 20 hours a month, and that means it needs 100 kilowatt hours of charging capacity, and a solar array that is going to produce about 100 kilowatt hours of charging capacity is going to be a 2 kilowatt array. Now, that's just kind of if you wanted to have a rule of thumb on how large of a solar array do you need to charge a solar peaker, that's kind of how I would do it. Is for every for every 50 kilowatt hours that you need in a given month, add 1 kilowatt of solar, and this assumption is how I backed into that calculation. Now, I think it's a lot easier to understand the math than to memorize it. So I always know what 1 watt of solar will do in my given territory, design territory, so that I can perform off-the-cuff sizing evaluations more quickly. Now, what is more likely with this Tesla Powerwall is that we will not install just one 5 kilowatt Tesla Powerwall, but install, say, 10 of them. So this won't be a $10,000 project. It'll be a $100,000 project. It won't be a 5 kilowatt output. It'll be a 50 kilowatt output. 20 hours of runtime at 50 kilowatts would be 1,000 kilowatt hours per month required to operate the system. And so we would need a 20 kilowatt array to do that. At this time, it's probably worthwhile to look at PV watts so that we don't have to rely upon our rule of thumb, or so that we can better understand it. So let me pull up PV watts and we'll do a design example. PV watts, if you just Google solar energy estimate, Google now has their own tool that they promote. But PV watts is a very popular tool put out by the Department of Energy. I'm going to go ahead and put it in my in the chat box here. What I do is I just go and I put in, my local area. Recently moved from North Mississippi to South Mississippi. I'm putting in my local area. And the only real thing that I change is I always just go and do a 1 kilowatt solar array, because that develops a scalar. And I don't want to get into the nuances of PV watts. We do that in other classes, but let me put it on the roof. I'll keep the loss factor the same. I'm going to reduce the tilt angle, because I know on a commercial flat roof, you're generally dealing with a 5-degree, or I prefer 10-degree tilt angle over 5 for a little bit better water runoff. You get residue sticking to the edges of the modules, and so at a 5-degree, that residue kind of creeps up more towards the cells of the modules, and so that extra tilt gets the particulate a little bit closer to the module frame. So over time, the scum builds up at the very edge of the frame and not across the whole surface. Anyway, we've done a PV watts calculation for a 1 kilowatt solar array, and what we have here is a 1,004. The RPV watts ratio in Biloxi, Mississippi is quite good. For every watt, we're producing 1.44 kilowatt hours. So, we're a little bit sunnier than our more conservative assumption. What I really want to know is how much energy I'm going to produce in the wintertime. And so what we can see here is our 50 kilowatt hour number is a little conservative. I see in December, I'm producing 88 kilowatt hours of electricity with 1 kilowatt of solar. Okay, well, what we're trying to do is develop this into a model. And so what we're going to do when we get into our design example is scroll down here into the hourly data, and that'll actually give us interval data for PV watts. And so if we can match up the interval data for PV watts and the interval data for the building consumption, we have our production data, we have our consumption data, and we can use those inputs to start sizing our battery. And so what I've learned here is that compared to what I've taught on the slides, my area is a little bit better for solar production. And instead of 1 kilowatt for every, 50 kilowatt hours, what I need is more like 1 kilowatt for every 88 kilowatt hours. So I could probably get away with a little bit smaller array. But what we're seeing is again, these are going to be, small solar arrays. Another thing to point out, let me pull the big view back up here. What I really wanted to do is go full screen. No, come back. Let me grab my place again. Present. All right. So, what I really wanted to point out here is that we're talking about a 50 kilowatt Tesla Powerwall. So that's its AC output. That's its when it's connected up to your electric service panel, it can output, if you have one of them, it can output 5 kilowatts. If you have 10 of them, it can output 50 kilowatts. That's the output. That's the end of the chute. So normally with solar, we have like a solar array, and it's 120 watts, and then we want to undersize the inverter, and we put it on 100 watts, and then we get to our output, and it's 100-watt output. Here we're doing our solar array, and it's 20 kilowatts, and then we're connecting it directly to the battery, more than likely. And then coming out of the battery is a 50 kilowatt inverter. So it's 50 kilowatts of output and 20 kilowatts of input, again, because they don't have to occur at the same time. The input's just to charge the battery, and then as long as we're filling the battery up, it's going to be available for this 50 kilowatt load. And that's something that we will have to detail and confirm when we build out our model in a little bit. So what we're looking at here for the Tesla Powerwall is 20 kilowatts of solar and 50 kilowatts of Tesla Powerwall. And so based off our pricing guidance, we'll go and say, okay, well, what is a 20 kilowatt solar array at the commercial level going to install at? Well, we go and we look at our, what the industry says the pricing should be. Well, then again, a commercial solar array, a 20 kilowatt solar array, is kind of in between the residential level and the commercial level. So, you might get that as part of this project, maybe a little low by itself, but as part of this project, it's going to install for about $2 a watt, kind of like right here on the price curve. And so here we are with our solar array that's 20 kilowatts at $2 a watt. That's going to cost $40,000. Then we have our 10 Tesla Powerwall 2s that cost, we're just assuming $10,000 each to install. So our project total is $140,000, and it comes with a 30% tax credit of $42,000. And so when I talk about the tax credit kind of paying off solar, the only reason why we get that tax credit is because of the solar power, and the value of the tax credit is about equal to the value of the solar array. And so one thing to keep in mind is that in a solar peaker design, especially one that you're planning to install this year or up until the remainder of the tax credit, if you're trying to juice the tax credit and it's a 30% tax credit, what we want is, we look at our solar project costs, and so we're saying, okay, the solar array costs 40,000 out of 140. The solar array is about 30% of our total project cost. And that would be another benchmark where you say, well, how do I make my solar peaker plant more cost effective? You want to make sure that your solar array is no more than 30% of your project cost, because your solar array isn't the moneymaker of the system. So if anything, if you can do a solar array that only costs 20% of the project cost, but it qualifies it for the 30% tax credit, that would be juicing the tax credit, making it work for you rather than against you. If you go and do a solar array that's half of the project cost and it doesn't really have a high generation rate, you'll just be adding unnecessary cost onto the project. So, the way I hone in on my optimal designs is I build a model that can do everything, and then I run a bunch of different design scenarios and see which one works best. And so that's kind of what I've noticed, is that you want to keep the solar array down to, the same percentage or less of what the federal tax credit is. Well, let's take another look at something. I've said that the energy savings don't really matter. Well, let's just take a look. For this system, for this $140,000 system, and we're assuming that half of the solar array goes into the battery, the other half goes into the building and rolls off as cost savings. Let's say the facility had an electric rate of 6 cents a kilowatt hour. The additional cost savings of this 20 kilowatt array is only $750. Whereas if the solar peaker achieves a 50 kilowatt demand reduction each month at $20 a month, well, $50 times $20 times 12 months is $12,000. So the annual savings of the energy from this 20 kilowatt solar array is $750. And that's just surplus production that we didn't really need, but it's hard to avoid, because if you're getting what you need in the wintertime, you're going to have surplus production in the spring and the fall and the summer when you don't really need the power. So there's always going to be a little bit of surplus, a little bit of savings there. But comparing, $750 to $12,000, the 95% of the savings from this array are coming from the battery rather than the solar array, when we ignore the tax credit. And so what's the payback going to be? I've got it on this next slide. So we got a 20 kilowatt solar array at $2 a watt that costs $40,000. And we got 10 Tesla Powerwalls at 13.5 kilowatt hours each. That's $100,000 installed. So the total project is $140,000. It comes with a 30% tax credit, so it's about $100,000 after taxes. At this point, I just left off the $750 because there are other cost factors in terms of, even if it's maintenance free, you might have some troubleshooting, you might have a learning curve, you might have additional, even if your insurance costs, you still have to pay for the additional coverage. So I just went and I modeled the $12,000 demand savings. You're looking at $100,000 divided by $12,000 in annual cost savings, and that gets you down to an 8-year payback. And so that's, an 8-year payback is not enough for most commercial customers. It is enough for some commercial customers. And you really want to get that payback to be under 5 years for commercial customers to get excited about this stuff. But this is just, we've made a lot of assumptions here. This is a very crude model. What we need to do is actually be a little bit more granular to really model what the true cost savings will be. But this is good enough for a ballpark estimate that says, with this particular rate structure and this particular load profile, we're starting at around an 8-year payback, and we might be able to improve it from there. And we have to also confirm that we can actually achieve that load reduction. So when we come back from our break, we're going to go through and build our own model in Google Sheets. So we can show you that just sitting at your desk, you can start poking around in these models without opening up your wallet to buy any commercial software. And then tomorrow we'll talk more about the commercial software, what it has to offer. Okay, so you get an 8-year payback on this solar peaker battery. Well, there's some other values that aren't really going to show up on this cash flow model, unless the client steps in and says, "Oh no, we need to model this much for that or this much for that." The reason is they're kind of hard to. It's hard to quantify how much a power outage is going to cost you, and maybe the business has some numbers there where they know of a power outage they experienced and it cost them this much money that you could put in to build upon that 8-year payback. I think this was one of the hurricanes. It might have been Florence that came through recently. I was on the Gulf Coast and getting like, what are you doing about the hurricane messages? But it kind of veered away towards us, and it basically resulted in very heavy rain in Georgia. And at the time, these were all the different electric cooperatives reporting downed lines and power outages as a result of the hurricane. For that matter, Hurricane Katrina took out, I think it took out 94% of Mississippi's electric grid for at least an hour. And some of my customers are doing solar because they lost power for multiple weeks. So, keep in mind with a solar peaker plant, you are buying a solar array and you are buying a battery. And so it is capable of protecting, it's not generating enough power to do 100% of your business. And so you won't be able to just proceed with normal business operation in the middle of a hurricane, but you will have some power there to protect refrigerators, air conditioners, computer systems, and have a degree of operability during the disaster that may or may not have some additional value to the commercial facility. I think we can generally agree that if you're in a region that loses power frequently, and this is a little confusing because what I found in Mississippi is there are regions that don't lose power, the typical, I'd say, what the rest of society is used to. But then you get out and onto some electrical grids and you lose power because of car wrecks or lightning strikes, or there's one client says he loses power 4 times a year and he has medical equipment and he's like 50 and his mother lives with him and she has medical equipment. The point is, this is an 8-year payback before we have measured or valued any kind of backup power or critical load backup capability that you have paid for. That's the problem with a batteryless residential solar system, is you're not really selling the customer a system they want, because they want that security of backup power during an outage. Whereas with a solar peaker facility, that comes with it. For that matter, you should see a longer product life out of your utility infrastructure, provided that the solar peaker does not strain the grid. The grid strains with outflow because our centralized grid is not designed to be a two-way street. Electricity will power the nearest load, and if they need more power on a grid, they can wheel it in from another grid. But the distribution grid is like a river running down a mountainside. The water's not supposed to go back up the mountain, and it messes with some utility transformers, etc., when electricity flows the other way. But if you're still talking about just reducing your on-site demand, you're talking about taking off load off of that utility transformer at the hottest times that it's operating. And so there will be some additional infrastructure value there. In fact, one common model is to give the utility access to the battery when you're not using it for additional incentives. In fact, there's a power company in Vermont called Green Power that does that. They provide incentives for customers to uh, install batteries so long as Green Power can dispatch them when needed. Australia is doing another kind of distributed power plant battery that way as well. And then, another thing that's interesting about solar peakers is they can apply to businesses that may have thought they didn't have the right rooftop before. Because historically, for commercial solar, you're looking for a big, flat, open rooftop where you can do a 500 kilowatt solar array. Whereas the solar peaker, less than 30% of your project budget's on solar. Most of your project budget is on the battery. And so you don't need as much roof space. And that could also have structural merits too. It might not be that all of the facility is suited for solar and only one portion of the building is strong enough to support those non-penetrating concrete ballasted systems that put a little bit more stress onto the building support members. The smaller array footprint fits more nicely onto a job site than a larger array footprint. And then lastly, this is kind of where you're looking at a sweet spot of a solar peaker where it's just generating a very small fraction of the building facility electrical load, although the savings realized are much greater than the amount of electricity produced. Whereas if you start doing something more than that, if you're not trying to do like 10% of the bill for a 30% reduction, ultimately, if you do all of the bill, you're doing 100% of the bill for 100% reduction versus 10% of the bill for a 30% reduction. So one of the elegant things about solar peakers is you can look at them as a phase one expansion. And so you start out by doing the solar peaker, save money, get a good payback, wait for battery prices to fall and decline, and then in a few years down the road, after the solar peaker has paid itself off, you can go back to the client and say, okay, well, now let's look at, doing all of your demand and not just your peak demand. Or, if we're already doing your peak demand, let's, take the whole facility off grid. Well, you already have the profitable gemstone pilot project that's already there, gathering facility data, making your future projects more accurate. It just sets the table for facility expansion to do more than the peak energy. At the same time, it's a good stopping point to say we're just going to focus on peak energy for now and then get our money back and see where batteries are 10 years down the road to do further expansion. And so you can we're going to talk about this project tomorrow, but some of the hardest loads to level are schools. So I think schools and solar are always going to be problematic because everyone wants solar on schools, but often schools get discounted electric rates. For that matter, their load profiles are like just massive electrical loads. And so what we see here is there's really not much of a peak. I mean, the battery to lower the curb of this school of any substantial degree, it still has to operate pretty much the whole day to lower that curb. Now there's some elegance here where you could say do a solar array that is, that big, which would then lower the curb. And then you have some nice spikes where you get into that 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening runtime operation of your battery. So up until this point, I've kind of poo-pooed the impact of solar and commercial peakers and said, the solar aspect is really just a subsidy grab. You do a solar array that costs 20% of the project budget and you gain a 30% tax credit. So why wouldn't you do solar? You'd be an idiot not to. Well, here is an example where, the only way to really implement anything more than just the teeniest, tiniest solar peaker plant is you have to have solar come in and provide more load leveling to actually go in and create the spikes that the solar peaker plant then levels. And so, solar and batteries really do have this multiplier effect where, fundamentally just remember, commercial facilities hit their peak use in the middle of the day. The solar array will come and reduce that load in the middle of the day. And then the batteries really want to focus on spiky peaks, which may already exist on the facility and not have any impact on solar, such as those load profiles we saw before. Or if you're a more traditional 8 to 5 business where everyone floods into the building at 8 and then leaves at 5, at that point, you might actually be doing a more substantial solar project to create those peaks and reduce the demand further. Or you might just start with something very teeny tiny, like a true pilot or demonstration project. Now, here's what I think is fascinating about teeny tiny demonstration projects for solar peakers. If I'm doing I recently installed a 14 kilowatt residential solar array for $2 a watt. It was a very straightforward project, single story, 2 pallets, 2 sub arrays, and I gave this guy a really good deal. Didn't make much money. Next time around, I'd probably charge a little more than that. But if someone came to me and said, okay, I'm not ready to do 14 kilowatts of solar, can I just do 1 kilowatt of solar? And can you come and do it for me turnkey? To do 1 kilowatt of solar, I might charge the guy $6 a watt simply because I have to make enough money to justify doing a small project. And that's what we talked about earlier with those soft costs. The smaller the project goes, the larger those soft costs get. And so what that means is at $2 a watt solar in Mississippi at 9 cents a kilowatt hour, I can make that project cost effective. At $6 a watt at 9 cents a kilowatt hour, I can't. In other words, there's a point where economies of scale kick in and make the project effective as long as you're at the same rate structure. A smaller project is going to be more costly per unit installed. That's just fundamentals. But they don't apply to solar peakers. Like in one sense, I kind of told you two different things. I said, well, commercial market is good because of economies of scale. But what I'm really talking about is it is substantially cheaper to install a 20 kilowatt or 30 kilowatt or 50 kilowatt solar array compared to a 7 kilowatt at the residential level. So when we're talking about small commercial 20 kilowatt, 30 kilowatt solar arrays, you've already gotten some economies of scale to get down to that $2 a watt price point. But then you don't have $10 million to spend on lithium-ion batteries, so you can only go down and do so much load leveling. But the thing about load profiles is they're generally shaped like cones or triangles. Now they can be wide and fat, kind of like this school profile, or they can be narrow and skinny, which is better. But a small solar peaker plant focuses on, regardless of the shape of the load profile, the narrowest and skinniest tips. Now there is a hard upper limit where actually doing a facility of this size is going to be a little bit tough unless you're darn sure you have year after year after year after year of facility energy reports, and for sure that you're going to shave off that little stubble. In other words, the solar array has to be larger than the hysteresis of the building, to use engineering terms. But what this means is the larger the project gets, the larger the project gets, the larger the battery gets. And what's important is that kilowatt rate is linear, but the volume, the area under the curve, is volumetric. The area under the curve is increasing faster than the linear demand charge, which means the more that you go deeper into your load leveling, the less cost effective the load leveling becomes. And what that means is there is a optimal cost effective point where you tie it off and say, okay, I'm only load leveling that much and I'm not going down any further because I'm going to have that much more of a battery bank, and that's as cost effective as I can make it while still being a substantial project. And you don't do a larger project that would do the entire load profile, because that would not get you that 1 to 3 cost savings benefit of generating 10% of the facility energy but reducing the bill by 30%. You would start approaching that generate 100% of the energy and reduce the bill by 100%, that 1-to-1 ratio instead of the 1-to-3 ratio. So that's the thing that's really unique about solar peakers, is that small projects are okay. And often it can be easier to talk a large business into doing a smaller project ahead of a larger facility overhaul. It's just easier to get approval that way, get it routed through the CFO. So to kind of recap some of the solar peaker guidelines, you want to have a small enough battery so that the solar peaker plant is cost effective. You want to have a large enough battery to shave off any spiky peaks. So those narrow spiky peaks are the most valuable. You want to have a large enough solar array so that if you have any midday peak demand, you're leveling that with the solar array and not with the battery. You may not have midday peak demand, and at that point, you're going to have a very small solar array, because you want to have a solar array that's just large enough to reduce peak demand in the middle of the day. So if you don't have peak demand in the middle of the day, that won't apply to you, and then you would just want to have a small enough solar array that is just large enough to fully charge the battery, and really not much more than that. And then you may also want to consider other project considerations like, okay, well, you now have this cost-effective economic engine generator, but do you really need something a little bit more robust to protect any on-site assets like refrigeration or computer servers, stuff like that? Okay, so we have a question from Todd about how often do rate makers change their demand rates, and we have some pick that really ties into our next topic of discussion. So what we'll do is we'll talk about this for about 15 minutes, and then we'll take a break. So it used to be that this, and by used to I mean like in 2017, I would bemoan the fact that it was very hard to research demand charges. We have a database of utility rates that are accessible for researchers, but it's not a perfect database, and it's a job to go through and pick out every single one. And the Energy Information Agency, which collects all sorts of electricity data for the United States and publishes them and gives its data to the other energy offices to make policy decisions on. But otherwise, the EIA is a pretty agnostic energy information agency, is what it's called. They collect all sorts of data on electricity. One thing they did not collect was the demand charges of each utility to map. So this data really only came to market in 2017 unless you collected it privately. So we're going to look through this report. Let me put that link in the chat box. Now, if you miss this stuff on the chat box, I give out, if you email me, I'll send you the link to the YouTube video of this class. So I record all the classes, put them on YouTube. So, you don't need to worry too much about not getting the links or whatnot. But this is if you want to explore it on your own. Let's pull it up again. So I picked out kind of what I thought was most interesting. So we were talking about different rate structures, flat rates, time of use rates, demand charges. One of the more interesting rate structures is called a tiered rate structure, where you have a different demand charge for the first amount of power, another demand charge for the next amount of power, another demand charge for the next amount of power. The key takeaway is all of these, and so a tiered rate structure is even more specific, are geared around, kind of penalizing buildings with high load and rewarding buildings with low load, although it's not a perfect system where, you may be a building with low load and then you have one little spike and you get unduly penalized. You may find that when you install a solar peaker, you have to make sure you don't disqualify yourself from the demand rate structure, because after all, we're trying to design a system that's optimal around the demand rate structure. And, if you disqualify yourself from the demand rate structure, then you're going to be out of luck. So the first question is, which utility have high demand charges? There's a lot of them. Remember, at the beginning of class, I said, I think solar peakers are going to cause a financial crisis. It's going to be a weird energy crisis because we're going to have a lot of supply coming to the market without an increase in demand. So I don't know what that'll do to the price of electricity, but the energy crisis will be on the balance sheets of the existing grid operators who don't make that transition from central to distributed energy, because their own customers are going to be designing systems to take out their revenue. And so as far as utility rates which charge relatively high demand charges, which I would say are being greater than $15 a kilowatt, that represents over 70% of commercial load. So what I think is kind of interesting is you take 70% of your commercial load, and let's say that, and I'd say that this at $15 a kilowatt, making the math easy, we would just say half, but it's probably actually more than that. It's probably more like, 70% of that commercial load, the revenue is a demand charge. And let's say that a commercial solar peaker can reduce this value by, let's be futuristic here. Let's say 50%. Let's say solar batteries in a few years from now are so attractive that instead of doing 10% of the facility energy and demand charge and reducing the bill by 30%, you do solar peakers to reduce the bill by 50%. So what that means is that we're going to have half of utility. We'll start back up again in about a minute or so. Well, it's a quarter after, but we're going to give everyone another minute to kind of get back to their desk, given that's a 4-hour program. So we'll start back up in a minute. All right. Welcome back. Let's get to where we picked back off. So what we're going to do now is go through a solar peaker design as if we just wanted to casually kind of look into it without rolling our sleeves up too much. It's good to know how to do solar peaker analysis crudely using a spreadsheet and just online free resources to give you a ballpark idea of what you're doing. I would be hard pressed to think a solar peaker design would be sold without going through a more professional computer software modeling process. But in the spirit of education, continuing education, I think we should program this by hand first. Also, because I have found that a lot of designers who go straight into trying to design a commercial peaker sizing without understanding the theory behind it or basics behind it kind of get lost in what the right battery size or AC output size or solar array size should be, and then they'll make mistakes on the stuff they're not looking out for. So why don't we just build everything by scratch and do a solar peaker plant design? So what we're doing it is for this particular rate structure, and we're kind of just going to go through the process for this. So to start out, I'm going to kind of give the answer sheet to y'all. Let me see if I can't share this with my link. I'm going to go ahead and put a link to this spreadsheet in the chat box there. I can't vouch to see if it'll go through your firewall or not, but we're going to create one from scratch with the exception of the building interval data. So let me show you how the building interval data came to me to begin with. So in this, let me unhide everything. This is a big Excel sheet, and we'll see that crunching the numbers for every 15-minute interval for every day of the year in conjunction with other data, it can take a while. Let's see how fast we can do it. So what we have is a download from the customer's utility meter account. And so what we see here is, well, don't look, that probably shouldn't be there. What we see here is the interval time, January 1st at 15 minutes past midnight. See if I can't zoom in a little bit more on that. Try that. Yeah, make it nice and big. All right, so here we have the interval data. And it starts off the first 15 minutes of the year. Happy New Year. And we get a couple of different columns and a multiplier. Usually the actual demand is not monitored. It's a ratio of it. And so we put this multiplier. And what we get is in column F here is the old building's power level measured in kilowatts. So the building interval data that you download from your utility account is going to look something like, let me, copying and pasting it is a little taxing. Let's see. Let's do this again. Let me zoom out for a minute so we can get a better view of it. Yeah, there we go. So we're going to copy all the building interval data to a new file and start from scratch. So you should be able to just log in to your utility data and get the spreadsheet file necessary to evaluate your building's energy use. I've had this data emailed to me sometimes in PDF file rather than a comma separated value format. And often with the comma separated value formats, you'll just be able to directly upload them into the commercial design software, or in this case, copy and paste from a Microsoft Excel file into a Google Sheets file. When you just get a PDF of all of this data, like a scanned copy, there's only so much you can do with it because transcribing all the numbers becomes the project. So it's really important just to start off with the actual interval data for the customer. And I think this is taking so long because it is also I have this other sheet open, so I think if I just let's see if I get. Let me just close this big file. There we go. Okay. So now we have our interval data. Maybe I'll just go grab it. All right, so let's see here. This takes more time. I'm just going to go back into the hard file. Oh, here it is. Have it open in Excel. So here is the Excel file for the interval data. I'm going to get rid of the meter number there. Not sure what you can do with it, but anyway. And it's a time frame for every minute of the year for the building's load. And so right off the bat, we can take the time interval and the load and make a XY chart and plot the facility load. Now, this is going to be a huge chart because, 15 minutes a day, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, it can tax not only the limits of your word processor, but what I have found is if you really want to start manipulating the data and running functions on them, it can kind of tax the limits of Google Sheets too, in terms of your maximum workbook size. But what we get from plotting this interval data on a graph is a chart that shows us what the building demand looks like. And I've made some screenshots for this already. I just wanted to kind of show you how to graph it, because sometimes webcasting and doing a lot of data pricing is not the best combination. I would like it to come back though. Well, let me just get back into the presentation so we can move on, because I got some screenshots here. Of, say, this graph. So here what we've done is we've graphed the entire building load profile for the year, and already I'm kind of surprised by a few things. One is that the wintertime load is substantially greater than the summertime load. And usually, or often it's the other way around, but this is a dental office up in the mountains of Colorado, and so they don't really have the high air conditioning loads, but they do have more wintertime heating loads. Now, another thing that's peculiar is right here, there was some huge demand event, and that's the maximum demand for summer. You can see that peak demand, basically it tripled his demand charge for that month compared to where it really needed to be. So we're going to take a look at that. This is what happens when you zoom in on the interval data. And that's why I didn't want to get into my email. There we go. This is what happens when you zoom in on this annual data. It starts to become a little bit more resolution. What I'm doing here is I'm zooming in on February or around whatever this time frame is, because I want to see what the building is looking like, what their load profile looks like under peak use. And so I'm exploring February in this instance, and we get more revelations by taking a look at the load profile, and that the facility is experiencing huge demand in the morning, and it looks like it's a pretty regular thing where the day starts and then there might be another surge of demand and then it tapers off. So in this case, solar is not going to do too much because it's going to be producing in the middle of the day, and then on the weekend here. And another thing we learn is that the building is open at least one day. It's open on Saturdays, because we only see it kind of shut off on Sunday. And so basically, we know from looking at this load profile that the size of the solar array really doesn't need to be that large. All we needed to do is enough to store kind of that peak. And so what we might even look at is saying, okay, well, whatever the height of this power demand is, I don't want my solar array to be larger than that, because I really don't want it to outflow onto the grid. Or if I was going to be real extreme, I would even look at this weekend off-peak base load and set the array to be that size, because then the array doesn't outflow at all under any circumstance. Now, in reality, you can do a slightly larger array and still avoid outflow penalty, because you can just dump it into the battery and cycle your battery if you want. Like you could wait to recharge it, instead of recharging it on this day, let that feed into the facility and then go recharge it with your solar production over the weekend. But that would take a more intelligent system. We're going to talk about that as we move forward. Because you're going to run into two options for your inverter systems. You're going to run into kind of dumb systems, which you just set a maximum facility power level to, and they just provide what they can until they don't have any more juice in the tank or in the battery bank. Or you'll get more top shelf battery management systems that will recognize opportunities like that to boost the cost effectiveness of the system. But they're more expensive too. And for that matter, if you did have a solar array producing a lot of power on this weekend, we have to remember in this example, the electricity value is only about 1.5 cents a kilowatt hour. So we might as well just burn it, because it doesn't really have any real value to the project. So now we're zooming in closer on this day in February, and what we see is the building kind of ramps up in the morning. Like from 8 to 9 we get that surge, and then it drops back down again. And so now that we're at a reasonable scale, we can see that the building is normally operating at about a 15 kilowatt base load, except right here in the morning its power demand has surged to 100 kilowatts. And so that's pretty encouraging, because what it says is, hey, I might have a real easy time shaving 25 or even 50 kilowatts off of this demand charge, and technically I might even be able to shave all the way down. I could shave potentially 75 kilowatts off of that demand charge and still have room to spare. So it looks like it looks like this is the perfect client for load leveling. Then I want to go and look at other extreme instances. Like, I don't want to just look at winter, I want to look at summer. I don't want to just look at winter and summer, I want to look at the spring equinox and fall equinox and kind of examine the different extremes to understand what's going on with the facility's energy use. Here's the summer load profile, where we had that really strange event. I don't know what happened here. I really don't. What I'm thinking is that in the wintertime, this is all like an electrical heating load. Maybe they don't have gas up in the mountains and they're on electrical heat. And you can actually back yourself into a corner here, because this dental office, in addition to getting a solar battery, another way they could do this is simply, if it is indeed the heaters, they could turn the heaters on earlier in the morning and use more energy total but less power, and just reduce their bill by doing nothing but energy management. At the same time, energy management can only get you so far. Maybe I've come across solar peaker application where they were really using the solar battery to provide some backup shutdown power for some computer servers, and then they wanted to use it as a solar peaker on top of that. When they're not experiencing power outages, you might as well put the battery to work. Okay, we want everyone to do solar peakers, so we're just looking at this demand reduction as the main value for them. Okay, some other things that a trained eye will notice is that here in the wintertime, my base load is around 10 kilowatts, and then when I get into the summertime, my base load is going to be still not very high. It is Colorado in the summer, but we're seeing a base load of maybe 15 kilowatts instead of 10 kilowatts. So we are seeing a little bit more capacity in the summertime rather than in the wintertime. And what that means is I could probably get away with a 20 kilowatt solar array, because in the wintertime, that solar array will be at a lower power point, and in the summertime, we'll have a little bit more load. So, as far as not wanting to really trigger any outflow issues, but wanting to have something that, wanting to know the parameters of my design, I'm going to be looking at solar arrays in that 10 to 15 to 20 kilowatt range. And really, to be perfectly honest, commercial solar arrays, 15 kilowatts is as small as you want to go. Otherwise, you're just getting into kind of residential sizes. 20 kilowatts, if you hold out, you can get a $2 a watt install price on, especially as part of a larger project. So obviously, this is a load we want to level. And looking at it, is we could take our load down from maybe 77 kilowatts down to maybe 20 kilowatts, maybe more than 20 kilowatts. So we're looking at maybe a 60 or 50 kilowatt load leveling in the summertime without hardly even running the battery. We're only running the battery one day this month. And so that might mean we go into heavy use in the wintertime, where we're cycling the battery, 3 or 4 times a week. But then we get into March, April, May, June, July, and then we only cycle the battery a couple times a month. And so all of a sudden you actually do get that 10-year life out of the battery, because you're not cycling it every single day. So even if you only have cycles, like 3,000 cycles, and that might give you an 8-year life, you might very well not use all those cycles on a solar peaker. Really, if you're cycling the solar peaker plant every single day, you've oversized. You're not trying to utilize a battery every single day. In an off-grid setting, you're using a battery every single day. In a solar peaker setting, you're only using the battery during peak time. So if you're using it every single day, it better be for a load that looks like this, rather than something that's more flat, where you just get diminishing returns the more you try to load level. And we also, don't ignore spring and fall. And so here's a load profile in spring and fall, and we don't get the winters, or that one time when all the air conditioners in the building clicked on at the same time and gave us a 70 kilowatt load. Spring and fall is is more subtle, laid back. Now, another thing we want to look at in this design is we want to pull up the customer's rate structure. It's always good to have a rate structure you can find online and read through and decipher. Most of the regulated utilities are good about that. Although some of these things can be as thick as a phone book. So this customer, I pulled up his rate structure, and what I found and what you want to look out for is a small general service demand charge. Because I don't think that you need to worry too much about demand charges going away. This is like a blind spot in utilities' eyes right now, because they're looking at demand charges as being something that's helpful. In fact, I think that the solar industry and the utility industry could actually get together and align themselves and make a lot of headway with rate policy in America by rallying behind demand charges, not just for solar owners, but for everyone. But here's the problem with this customer. We're seeing this customer is making over a 50 kilowatt load, because we see that, in his data here. But what we want to do is reduce his load as much as possible. And what we're realizing is, to do that, his load is going to drop below 50 kilowatts. His normal base load is going to be below 20 kilowatts, maybe 15 kilowatts. And so we want to say, well, what's going to happen to the design if I reduce his load and almost, eliminate it? And what we found is that, yes, indeed, there is a little magic number that you don't want to go beyond. If his load is less than 50 kilowatts, he'll be moved on to the small commercial generation rate. And that small commercial generation rate doesn't have a demand charge. It's just an energy charge. And so at that point, the battery is going to be worthless, and it's the solar array that is going to be more worthwhile, except we've installed a large battery and a small solar array, and now we have the opposite, something that would be more like a net metered residential array. And so you have to look out to see what the small generation service is, and we'll show you how we address this hurdle in the design as we continue. And the answer is, well, there's going to be 1 month where you don't load level below 50 kilowatts. You take your 1 month of worst demand management and set that at 51 kilowatts as your threshold. And then you make sure during that month that you turn on your heater and make sure that you hit that 51 kilowatt threshold, and then you're good. And you demand manage the rest of the time. At the same time, if they force you onto the energy rate, you could always, increase your load to knock yourself back into the demand rate, or consider expanding the solar array at that point to approach more of a comprehensive whole facility expansion. And so that's where I think like solar peakers are such great phase 1 expansion projects, because you can put them on the facility today and get a short-term payback. But then if the rate structure substantially changes, it's not going to change in your favor as a power producer. So the option will be at that point to take the building off grid. And at that point, you're going to be doing a larger solar array and battery if you have the space to. So get the solar peaker in now, get it paid off, and then it makes your expansion plans a lot more realistic and easy to win down the road. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is we have building interval data. The next thing we need to do is get production data from the solar array. So for that, we use PV Watts. So for that, we use PV Watts, and here we're back on our PV Watts example in Pueblo, Colorado, where we've done a model for a 1 kilowatt solar array. And here at the end of PV Watts, we go and download our hourly solar data. So I actually have that data open already. So here we go. Let me try that again. So I think I have to rerun my PV Watts calculation. I think it must have timed out or something. So anyway, let's start from the beginning. Here we are on PV Watts, and this client is in Pueblo, Colorado. And so we're going in, and I'm just assuming a flat roof. A steeper roof will make the model better. So, and it's not that big of a difference. I'm not going to get hung up on it. I'm doing a 1 kilowatt solar array, standard modules on the roof. I'm not messing around with any of these numbers. This system loss numbers is conservative. The tilt angle, I'll go down to a 10-degree tilt angle, face them 180 degrees. Honestly, at that shallow of a tilt angle, the way the modules face doesn't really matter. You could even point them north at that shallow of a tilt angle. You know, if a plate's perfectly flat, it doesn't matter which way its orient faces. It's just facing straight up in the air. Well, anyway, here's our solar array. Let's see if this works. There we go. All right. So here is our 1 kilowatt solar array in Pueblo, Colorado. And remember, the reason why I do 1 kilowatt is because we're going to use this data as a scalar. We'll import what we're looking for. We got a whole bunch of stuff that we talk about in our solar classes, but what we're really looking for is this number right here, the AC system output. This is the output value from the solar array. And so what I want to do is I want to copy and paste this system output value and match it up with my building interval data. The only problem is my building interval data is done in 15-minute intervals, and my PV Watts data is done in intervals of 1 hour. And it used to be kind of a linear algebra problem of how to replicate the PV Watts data into 4 data sets and then refilter it to make sure that they're all in the proper order so that you could match up the data of your interval data to the data of your PV Watts data. I'm going to show you a trick that I do to overcome this step. And if you don't know this trick, you might get stuck on this step because otherwise you have to really need to know how to program a computer to figure this one out. But what we know is that this PV watts data is in order. You know, it's a 1 hour block starting at the beginning of the year and ending at the end of the year. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this data set a rank and just number it, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way down to 8,760, that many hours in the day. Well, remember our interval data is 4 times that much data because it's in 15-minute periods. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this number system and I'm just going to, you know, at this point I don't care about the rest of the PV watt stuff because we're going to export this specific column. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste it 4 times or 3 times to get 3 sets of data. And remember, we've preserved, this is the output. And this is the, I'll call it the rank. And so now what I'm going to do is I have 4 sets of this data. I'm going to go and I'm going to sort it. And I'm going to sort it by rank from smallest to largest. And so now all of a sudden I have 4 data sets for each hour. And so I've broken the output level of the power into 15-minute intervals by using the spreadsheet, you know, using that little trick. So you have to, the trick is you have to remember to add this extra column and rank the data 1 through 8,760 and then copy and paste that group so that you have 4 data sets, each with a rank that can then be sorted so that all the first hour's data shows up at the top and the second hours of data shows up at number 2. It sounds simple, but you know, the problem is you get into other functions within spreadsheets that can crunch these numbers and do that sort of stuff for you, but it's too much data. So anyway, so now now we have our 15-minute interval data. So we're going to go back into our spreadsheet and we're going to paste it next to our building consumption. And if we did our job correctly, this should match. One issue is the PV watts data is in watts, and it needs to be in kilowatts. And so what I'm going to do before I copy and paste it is divide by 1,000 and turn it into kilowatts. So it all looks good. Now what we have to remember is that this column is for a 1 kilowatt array. And what we actually want is something like a, you know, 20 kilowatt array, but we want to vary it. And so I'm going to put a toggle here and basically just multiply whatever my output is for my solar array by the array size. And that'll allow me to quickly kind of switch between a 15 kilowatt array, a 5 kilowatt array, a 50 kilowatt array, and evaluate different price points. Now look here. It looks like we did something wrong because our data doesn't make it all the way down to the bottom of the data set. We're actually off by, it looks like we're off by an entire day. Well, that's because one of our data sets has leap year in it. So we'll look for So here are our interval data. The longer of the two has a leap year in it, which our other data set does not have. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the rest of the data set and I'm going to back out leap year. And then I'll just go and take the previous day and repeat it. So here's January 28th. I'll just take my output levels and repeat them right there. All right. So all that looks good. I'm beginning to wonder. Yeah. Okay. So now we have two columns. We have our total building consumption, and we have our array output as a function that we can toggle. The next thing we have to know is our battery bank size. And so for that, you could say your guess is as good as mine. I'm kind of using this rule of thumb of like 20 kilowatts of solar to 50 kilowatt of battery output, but really our model is going to tell us. So why don't we just start off with a guess of like 100 kilowatt hours? And what that means is on the first day of the year, our battery bank is going to start at 100 kilowatt hours. The next thing we need to do is we need to take a guess. So at this point, we have to kind of change our model again and say, okay, well, this is the array size, battery bank starting, max. And it's always good to put your labels on here so you keep your units straight. Well, then the next step is we got to know what our maximum load is, what we're trying to load level. And I'm going to spare you kind of setting all this Excel spreadsheet up. I wanted to show you that you got to kind of look out for leap year and daylight savings time as well. But look, after we pasted that extra day, here we are, and it looks like we're off by 1. This gap here, but then we come back down, and it's actually we're into January 1st, and so that gap in my data, we were off by 1 interval, and that gives us all of 2016, the load profile and the array output. We take a guess as to the battery bank size. And then remember, we were going for a maximum load reduction of 51 kilowatts. And so basically, I would look at, say, the array output and the total consumption, and you could start off by exploring, well, what's the difference between the two? And so I'm going to say, okay, well, if my array consumption, if my column is, well, anyway, let's just go down. Sometimes it's good just to look at the data. Here in the morning, we see our building turning on and going from like a 4 kilowatt base load to a 55 to 88 to 89 kilowatt base load. Here's our array output in kilowatts, and it looks like it's really not doing much. Sometimes it's best to mess with the digits a little to make them a little more readable. So anyway, I'm going to go back to the where I have this spreadsheet completed, which is in that link that I sent you in the chat box, to kind of take a look at the finished product. So I kind of set up a first iteration and a second iteration to kind of show you where my first attempt was at the design, and then where I put more accuracy and time into the model and improved my payback from then. So here I have my interval data, and so I have my old building demand level. And so all this stuff is this val status, multiplier, total KWH, all that stuff is really, you can just ignore it. It's from the old interval data Excel file. So then we get to where they convert to the building demand. So here's our building demand going up from 4 kilowatts up to 88 kilowatts. Here's our 1 kilowatt array, and then I have my array size in the actual production so we can see it kind of scale up. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just hide this column because it kind of gets in the way. So if we take our old building demand and we subtract our on-site solar production, we'll get our new building demand, which is kind of interesting because you can explore how solar without batteries may or may not reduce your building demand. Well, and then I got to a, what I have running down this column is a maximum load. So I can say, okay, well, even with just the solar array and the battery, I went from a maximum load with no solar of 100 kilowatts, and now I have a maximum load with just solar and no battery yet of 100 kilowatts. The solar array really didn't do anything to reduce that maximum load. But those kind of get in the way too, so I'm going to remove them. So in my first iteration, I had a demand target of reducing all of the demand on site down to 51 kilowatts and not anything further, because we didn't want to disqualify ourselves from the demand rate structure. So I went in and I put a guess of the required battery size. So I just guessed, okay, I guess I need 160 kilowatt hours. And then from that point on, I'm taking my old building demand and my solar production and my battery capacity, and I'm running basically an Excel formula that says, okay, well, if my new building demand is equal to my demand target, so if I've load leveled the building demand to meet my demand target, then the battery capacity is the battery capacity minus the difference between the old building demand and the solar production. We have this weird divided by 4 because we have to remember it's just a 15-minute interval. If we have a kilowatt and the block is an hour, that's 1. But we've divided it into 4 components, and so this power level is only being sustained for 15 minutes rather than an hour. So the energy that's being drawn out of it because of the difference between the old building demand and it being driven down to 51 kilowatts, that capacity comes out of the battery bank. And so basically we write a formula into Excel that says, well, let's go from left to right. Here we have a formula that says the new building demand after the battery. And what it's saying is if my new building demand with solar is still greater than my target demand of 51 kilowatts, then turn on the battery bank. So let me just repeat that again. If I have a facility that's at 100 kilowatts and my solar array is at 20 kilowatts, it'll draw 30 kilowatts out of the battery bank until the battery is depleted. And so I have an Excel that says, okay, well, basically let's see how this plays out. Once our building demand goes up to where it used to be, let me zoom in a little. Our building demand used to be 89 kilowatts. Well, now we've set it to be driven down by the battery to 51 kilowatts and take that out of the battery bank. And so we see our battery bank was full, and now it's beginning to deplete because we're using the battery here. And so at that point, I run a search for my minimum battery level throughout the entire year. And I need to make sure that my battery is full. And so if I had guessed I need 100 kilowatt hours out of my battery, my model takes a minute to update. There we go. It updated. So my model says, oh, my battery bank, my theoretical battery bank that either when the solar array is on, my actual array kilowatts, either the solar array is on and I'm adding to my battery bank until it meets its maximum size, at which point it stops adding to it even if I'm productive. When my solar array is on, I'm adding to the battery bank. When my battery is performing load leveling, I'm subtracting from the battery bank. And I do that for every single 15-minute interval of the year. And all of a sudden, I have a chart for the usage of my battery. And so that got me to this chart right here. And this really shouldn't surprise us. We saw our peak loads occurring in the wintertime, and now what I see is that I'm drawing my battery. Here's my battery starting at 160 kilowatt hours, and I'm drawing it down to 100 kilowatt hours or 60 kilowatt hours or 60 kilowatt hours or 110 kilowatt hours. So I'm drawing it down during this time. And here at the tail end of the year, this might be in November or it might be in early December. That's when I'm really drawing down my battery bank to its maximum size. So that's where that 160 kilowatt hours is really needed. And if I did a 160 kilowatt hour battery bank, that might be what's needed to get my building load down to 51 kilowatts at this point. But it still might not be optimal, because I have all this. I'm not really utilizing my battery at this time, but all this stuff can offer little clues on where that peak might be. Now, when you use a commercial software, it has optimization algorithms that perform the tasks to evaluate the shapes of these curves that we're doing manually right now. But what we see is that, we might be able to get away with a smaller battery bank if we could do something about this peak right here. So maybe with a little bit of facility management, we can chop the needed battery bank down and then do a smaller battery bank from there to not level everything, but just level the tips if we're, reaching for budget. But I ran into, again, I'll be the first to admit that this is kind of just the subtracting the power level and adding the production and subtracting the consumption is a little crude, but it starts to give you the shape of the battery. All right, let me keep going. So, and this is the problem that I ran into with this early model of trying to get down to 51 kilowatts. Is I'm getting down to 51 kilowatts in January, 51 kilowatts in Feb, and March, and April, and May. Well, I'm still June and July. I never get up to it to begin with. I get down to 51 kilowatts in August and September and November and December. And I go and I look at my payback. I say, okay, in January, I'm shaving off 43 kilowatts, in Feb, 50 kilowatts, in March, 40. I add all that up, and I assume my solar array is installed for $2 a watt, and I have my energy rate at a penny and a half, and I have my installation budget pegged to the cost of the Tesla Powerwall 2, and so I have $100,000 project, and the cost savings are however much demand I've leveled divided by this guy's demand charge, which is really on the high side. It's $26 a kilowatt. And so I come out to this $100,000 project after the 30% tax credit having a 8-year payback. And that's really not good enough. I mean, this is a site that has one of the spikiest loads. They're on one of the highest peak demand rate structures. We should be able to achieve something much better than an 8-year payback. And so just trying to solve the model with just a couple of very basic Excel formulas or spreadsheet formulas is not good enough of a way to go about modeling. Now, what the big change that I ended up doing in the second iteration of my model is, instead of trying to drive down to 51 kilowatts for the entire year, I played it fast and loose. We saw from our battery usage chart that there is this kind of extreme usage event sometime in November or December that is unusual, unlike the rest of the year. And so if there's 1 month of the year where I might not try to get down to 51 kilowatts but stay above that, maybe I don't try and work the battery so hard on the month of its most extreme use. Furthermore, we saw all those instances of the base load being not 51 kilowatts, but 15 kilowatts or 10 kilowatts. So can't I'm not using the battery in the middle of the year. Can't I use the battery to do more aggressive demand modeling? And the answer is yes, but our model, which just assumed a maximum 51 kilowatt cutoff point, that wasn't good enough. What we need to do is go in and assign individual cutoff points for every single month of the year, or in other words, for every single seasonal change, for every single billing structure or seasonal shift and facility energy use. We need to program a different load level. And so the big change that I made in the second iteration of this model was to go in and assign a target load for every month of the year. And so instead of having this little box up at the top where I'm putting in my new demand target, which is just carte blanche across the board, now I had to go in and put in a month by month by month demand target. And I made it, in most cases, I made it so I no longer have this demand target box anymore. And it all feeds from the cell in this sheet. And so at that point, with my model, what you might use an optimization algorithm, with some calculus 3 to solve. I'm just going around and playing it with my design thresholds. See, in this December, I went with a 71 kilowatt load, because if I went down to 51 kilowatts, and it takes a while for all the formulas to run through. But what this is doing is this number is feeding back into my second iteration model, where I have a guess for my battery size, and then I have my minimum battery level. What you'll see is in the month of December now, I'm referencing the second iteration demand management sheet. And this number, so I'm putting in a 51 kilowatt hour load. Well, I've hidden a column here to make it, to make it look better. But when I'm actually doing my design here with this max new load, what I have is a column that tells me the minimum size of my battery bank. And so I'm going and I'm adjusting these numbers. 51 says my battery bank is too small, so I'm going to go in and put a 60 and see what happens. Oh, well, that's probably too conservative. My battery bank is still too small by negative 67. If I go in and put in 100, my battery bank goes, up. And I just through guessing and checking, I hone in on the fact that, if I did a 71 kilowatt hour threshold, that gets me exactly to what I need. Now, how I honed in on exactly what I needed for my battery bank size is also a matter of guess and check optimization. So what I have here is a cell that tells me my minimum battery level. And so initially I had guessed 100 kilowatt hours. And that told me that my minimum battery level for the entire year it'll update soon. But what it'll tell me is the battery level for the entire year, the minimum battery level was 10 kilowatt hours. And so, my minimum required battery size, assuming I'm using the full capacity of the battery, I don't need these 10 kilowatt hours. We see how so all of this is kind of linked throughout the spreadsheet. Now all these numbers of minimum battery size is 10 kilowatt hours higher. Another thing we can do is toggle our array size. And so what we can look at our battery levels and go back and go back down to what we think is our lowest cost, smallest possible battery size. To hit the demand targets we were looking at. All right, so that's updated. And the next thing we want to look at is, well, what size of solar array do we need, or how might that help us? So, let's explore this. Let's go from a 14 kilowatt solar array to a 21 kilowatt solar array, and see how that impacts our battery level. So what that's going to do is it's going to scale up the array production, which will feed more energy into the battery whenever the sun's productive. But see, the problem is the sun you need it to be productive, but it's not necessarily productive every single day. And so it won't necessarily have an impact on your minimum battery size. Maybe that minimal battery size was achieved not in the during a series of sunny weather and high electrical load, but during a series of overcast weather instead. Anyway, what we have to do is rely on what the numbers are going to tell us. And what we see is going with a larger solar array. In this case, it didn't change the minimum required battery level at all, even though we increased the size from 14 kilowatts to 21 kilowatts. Why don't we keep going up to, say, 28 kilowatts and watch this minimum battery level? And and basically what we're looking for is what is the right size of the solar array where it may be helping me with demand management slightly, but it's really just there to make sure that I don't run out of juice. So we see going from a 14 kilowatt array to a 28 kilowatt array, it didn't impact the required minimum battery size, because that required minimum battery size is between two mountains of sunny weather, but it's down in the valley. So it's gone a couple of days without getting recharged, and no matter how much solar we throw at it, the very next sunny day it's getting recharged, but it's gone, it's barely adjusted. Now if we go down and we do a 7 kilowatt solar array. So we started at 14 as kind of the right size. If we start at 7, and look at the number, what we're probably going to discover is that it's not enough. And we might actually see this number, this minimum battery level, drop substantially, which is weird because it didn't. We doubled the size of the solar array and the number didn't budge. Now we're cutting the size of the solar array in half. And there you go. Look, our theoretical minimum battery level is negative 2,845 kilowatt hours. So, a 7 kilowatt array is way too small. And so basically what by assigning every single month or every single billing cycle a demand goal, and looking at the facility's seasonal energy use, the confines of its rate structure, and the production of the solar array for that matter, we're able to fine tune our model and say, no, we don't need a 20 kilowatt array. We only need a 14 kilowatt array. No, we don't need a 160 hour battery bank. We only need a 90 hour battery bank. And so looking at with all these new load targets, not just going down to 51, but saying, you know what, in June, we're not running the heater, we're not running the AC, we're not running anything. We can load level this building all the way down to 12 kilowatts if we want to. So let's do it. So we know that in the worst month in December, we're going to be above 51 kilowatts, so we're not going to lose our rate structure. So all other seasons, let's see how aggressive we can be. And it turns out in February, we didn't get down to 51 kilowatts either. Now, we might have been able to if we increase the size of the battery or increase the size of the solar array, we might be able to go further, but we're sliding further and further down that slope and no longer shaving off the tips. So at this point, I kind of complete my model by integrating an economic assessment. And so down here at the bottom, I've taken my cumulative monthly demand reduction. So I have my old demand and my new demand, and the difference is worth $26 a kilowatt to this client. And so I have my old demand and my new demand, and I know he's saving $14,400 in demand charges off of this model, which is more exact than our old model. And what we found is that by being more exact, we're actually to push the economics a little bit further. And so here I have a 14 kilowatt array being installed at $2 a watt. And so that's a $28,000 array. And I have my Tesla Powerwall as a total installed solution costing $700 a kilowatt hour. And that's a $63,000 project for a combined total of $91,000. Of course, it does get the federal tax credit, which brings the total project cost down to $63,000. And then the annual cost savings is $14,400. And so what we saw in our more crude model was that guessing got us to an 8-year payback configuration. And by making the model a little bit more refined, we were able to find a configuration that could actually deliver us a 4.5-year payback for this particular job site. And maybe getting better resolution than this and employing more intelligence in our load leveling and not just saying, oh, well, this is a flat amount for this month and this is a flat amount for this month, but actually looking at factors like the weather, the building energy management capabilities in its own right, the amount of reserve capacity left in the battery, so that drives how aggressive you can be in demand throttling, and the maximum demand that you've previously read during the month. All of those factors can go in to improving the model beyond what we've currently done, and that's the realm of commercial design software. As you can see, this is kind of pushing the limits of Google Sheets cloud computing services. So anyway, really what I wanted to point out is I have my economic model integrated into my performance model, so that if I decide, okay, well, I want to go and what I need to do is not have the payback amount, the payback year here. So basically, now I can play around with my array size and say, okay, well, I'm not going to do a 90 kilowatt hour battery. I'm going to do a 120 kilowatt hour battery. And we'll see this economic payback jump from 4.5 years to something higher than that. And so that's basically the best way I know of modeling commercial peakers with pencil and paper, is to be as granular as you can to set individual monthly targets, and then to finish out your economic model and base your final configuration on whatever has the quickest payback. So as you can see, adding 30 kilowatt hours of battery capacity pushed our payback beyond 5 years. And really what you want is to get that's if we increase the size of the solar array, which we, as you can tell, that did not matter to our battery having a larger array, that can push the payback out as well. And so what we're trying to do is open up solar markets that people might not know exist. For example, this particular project came to me from a solar installer who said, look, I have a commercial client with a high demand charge, but his energy rate has been so low. There we go. If we did a 28 kilowatt array and a 120 kilowatt hour battery bank, our project economics look good, but not that exciting. So what we want to do is do just enough to make sure our payback is nice and short. And so the solar installer said, this dental office is what I would consider to be a long-term lead, which is that the owner of the building had told him, I want to do solar, I want to do solar, I want to do solar. And every time he looks at the rate structure, he says, well, you only get a penny and a half a kilowatt hour for your output, so it's not going to be economic. And all along the time, he's looking at a payback that is one of the best in the industry at 4.5 years. I think I got some questions, so let me pull those up. So it says, John says, JR, you can set the demand target lower than 51 kilowatts. The sheet was a minimum of 10 kilowatts or a maximum of 50 kilowatts. The customer should actually be in a mid-sized commercial tariff. So, yeah, that's, and we ended up driving it. It's that if you go over 50 kilowatts, you'll get pushed into that next ratchet up. And now, in the past, facility energy managers have tried to manage their demand to avoid that next ratchet. Well, now what you can do is knock yourself into the next ratchet for a month and then do demand management with a lithium-ion battery for the rest of it. You might actually find that if you're at a level of demand that's right on the edge between two rate structures, between a commercial demand management and a residential kind of energy-only rate structure, you might find that the combination of a solar array and a battery you can knock yourself into whichever category you want to be in. So kind of, now it lets you use kung fu with your electricity and to do what you want with. All right, let's get back through into the presentation, and then we will talk about different battery chemistries. Okay, so here's what we were just talking about. The actual demand is greater than 10 kilowatts, but less than or equal to 50. So we're outside of that range. Our customer is going to keep his more heavy demand rate structure. Our project economics will hold. Okay, so this is just a reminder to get the performance data out of PV Watts. That it is always good once you have this interval data to graph it so that you can see visually what's going on. As we'll talk about in our design examples tomorrow, for diagnosing and honing in on the optimal configuration, sometimes the design algorithms from the commercial software are just tools. They're not solutions. They're best guesses, but you sometimes have to work alongside your knowledge of the rate structure and solar capabilities to get the computer algorithms headed off in the right direction. And so being able to visually display what's going on with the facility energy use and then develop a narrative to explain what's going on is, why is that particular day in December so bad? And what can we do about it? Adding that narrative to the load profile will help you diagnose what direction you need to go in terms of right sizing. Should you focus on tweaking the solar array or not? And the visualizing of that data is something that the commercial design softwares do quite well. Okay, so here we are with our $91,000 project with our $2 a watt solar array, our 90 kilowatt hour battery bank and inverter Tesla Powerwall solution. We apply the 30% tax credit. Our demand savings are $14,400, and our simple payback is 4.5 years, which is better than a residential payback, which is better than utility scale payback. So when we're talking about residential, utility scale, or commercial, we get this irony that the commercial market segment is the smallest, and yet 70% of commercial loads have demand charges of over $15 a kilowatt, and all of those facilities should at least get looked at for a small solar peaker as being more cost effective than their rival market segments. Okay, so now we're going to look at a couple of different battery technologies and get into kind of material selection. Lithium ion can be a little confusing because we're just getting used to lithium ion, but there's actually a couple of different tiers of lithium ion technology that are out there. So the first lithium ion battery that I want to take a look at is called SimpliPhi. And we're going to circle back around to the Tesla Powerwall. But for the time being, we're going to start looking at some batteries that are a little bit higher performance than the Tesla Powerwall and talk about their advantages and disadvantages and kind of work our way back down to less premium solutions. All right. Okay, so what we're looking at is an American battery company called SimpliPhi, and we're looking at one of their kind of more powerful lithium-ion batteries. So that's where these specifications come from. We see a few things. The first is that the cycle rating of this battery, they say it's 10,000 cycles, but that's not using the battery fully. In our model that we just did, we didn't really allow for any spare capacity of the battery. I suppose we could add some in, but if we did a very precise model, we would have to go and buy 20% more battery capacity in order to obtain that 10,000 cycle rating. Now, do you really need a 10,000 cycle rating is another question, because if you're only using the battery for 1/3 of the year, then you may not need it. You know, but it's one cycle a day basically, or maybe a heavy duty solar peaker might be pulling a morning and evening shift in the summertime. So I suppose you could get up to a maximum of maybe 400 or 500 cycles a year out of a lithium ion battery that's in heavy use. But our battery is not in heavy use. We're really not using it all that much. And when we are using it, you know, how deeply are we discharging it? What is its utilization rate? That's all stuff that gets crunched in commercial design software for you. So if we're cycling our battery every single day, we may want the extra capacity for more than one reason and get that 10,000 cycle rating. If we proceed as we had just modeled to go after that 4.5 year payback, where we're not, you know, we're discharging our battery to its full rated value, we're only going to get a 3,500 cycle warranty out of it. But what I think is kind of interesting is that's still pretty good, because 3,500 cycles, you know, if we're only using it for half the year, you know, we're looking at a 19-year life out of that battery, you know, to begin with. And so, you know, maybe that's not as important for a commercial solar peaker as it would be for an off grid where you are using the battery every single day. Operating temperatures, you know, the companies, many of the companies say you can put the batteries outside, although I would not. In fact, when we look at the kind of more commercial scale solutions available, we'll see that many of the larger skids are putting air conditioners and stuff into the containers that hold the batteries. Um, you know, there's just a lot of information on heat being bad for lithium ions. So, yeah, I would look at this operating temperature as saying it can operate outside, it can operate in higher heat. You know, maybe it's the fact that I'm from Texas, but you know, 120-degree heat is obtained all the time down south. Um, just kind of a reminder, uh, when we talk about battery bank voltages, like a 24-volt battery or 48-volt battery, we're talking about nominal voltages. Their actual voltages are going to be a little bit higher than that. So Simply Phi this is a battery that's called a lithium iron phosphate battery, and it's considered to be of higher quality than the Tesla. Uh, it's also more expensive. Now, this is another kind of battery called lithium titanate that is an even more top shelf than lithium iron phosphate. And you can kind of tell it. I have a comparison chart here, but you can kind of tell it in its cycle rating, which is always this 80% depth of discharge cycle rating is a number that kind of carries through the battery industry. So this lithium titanate battery is rated for 30,000 cycles at 80%, whereas the lithium iron phosphate is rated for 10,000 cycles. You know, what do you think the Tesla Powerwall cycle is? Is it going to be more or less than that? Well, you know, here we are. We'll look at their may not tell us it's 80% cycle rating. But the short of it is it's going to be less than that. Okay, so this lithium titanate battery is kind of still. Now, I've never seen them in the field. I've never heard of them in the field. This is like you make Chinese friends on LinkedIn who give you solar ads all the time for stuff, and this is from where they're advertising it. But I think it's worth trying to making an attempt at evaluating the technical differences between battery technologies to see if a common theme emerges. For one, we can see that the lithium titanate battery weighs more per kilowatt hour stored than lithium iron phosphate. And one thing that leaps out of my mind is it's kind of the same with industrial lead acid versus regular lead acid, like a golf cart battery, in that the industrial flooded lead acid is much more dense, heavier. We also see some fundamental differences in cell chemistry because the lithium titanate battery is at outputs more energy per volt than lithium iron phosphate, and that's also replicated in its cycle life. None of those are particularly important to solar peakers, though, although they're kind of adjectives of the same theme, which is performance. In the previous design example, we don't really need a high performance battery. We just need a battery that can discharge enough energy without blowing up that we can go buy and have it be cost effective, and the Tesla Powerwall fit the bill. If we doubled our battery cost and went with something that's even more high end, like a lithium iron phosphate battery, that 4.5 year payback would not have been a 4.5 year payback. So what the heck do you need a more expensive, high performance battery for? Anyway, I had to kind of search high and low to find some examples. Well, I did find one. Actually, before we get to that, let me look at one more step up from lithium titanate, which is supercapacitors. In our kind of more basic battery class, we talk about how there's lead acid and then how lithium ion, you can charge and discharge much more quickly than lead acid, although there is a limit to the charge and discharge rates of lithium ion, and like the Tesla Powerwall being a kind of like a Macintosh approach. They say, well, we're going to give you an inverter that throttles the battery so that you must discharge it over 2.5 hours. There's no way you can possibly discharge it faster than that, and that way we know it's going to achieve the performance it's rated for, yada yada. You get a high performance lithium ion battery like lithium iron phosphate, or in the future lithium titanate, because you need discharge capabilities that are even quicker than 2 hours. So maybe that would mean a discharge capability of 1 hour, or maybe that would mean a discharge capability of 10 minutes. So you can get on these ratings. Like, here's the SimpliFi spec sheet, and we have a rated capacity of 3.5 kilowatt hours at a C2 discharge rate. And what that means is over a 2 hour period, we can get 3.5 kilowatt hours out of it. Now that's going to be at a continuous discharge current of 34 amps. And so if a volt times an amp is a watt, if you multiply 34 amps by the voltage of the array, which is 51.2 volts, you get that the 3.5 kilowatts hours. And you're like, well, hold on, don't you get half of that? Because 3 times 5 is 15. Oh yeah, but it's at the C2 rating. So, you get like 3.25 kilowatt hour or 1.75 kilowatt hours for 2 hours. Okay, well then we have this other item that says its maximum discharge current, which is 60 amps for 10 minutes rather than 34 amps for 2 hours. And so actually this lithium iron phosphate, better than the Tesla Powerwall battery, can actually output more than its C2 rating for a 10-minute burst. It can get up to 60 amps, at which point the heat from the battery and the efficiency of the battery have either fully drained the battery or have caused it to throttle down a bit. Now, in the off-grid class, we talk about burst modes on inverters. And so your off-grid inverters, and your battery inverters for that matter, like the Tesla Powerwall, it'll have its 5 kilowatt output rating, but then it'll also have a surge rating that can output much more than that. So this is an off-grid battery inverter, and it's rated for 12 kilowatts, but for 20 seconds, it can surge up to 36 kilowatts. But what it needs is a battery that can surge with it. If you surge with a flooded lead acid and you get down that discharge rate, you may just generate a bunch of heat without really delivering a lot of power to the system. And so in a residential off-grid home, you really select your devices to avoid power surges because you're running off of lead acid. Well, in our case with lithium ion, we're trying to fight power surges, and so to do 2 hour or less spiky loads, you really need a lithium ion battery of some nature for that. Now the Tesla Powerwall, it says that it has a burst mode too. And so the Tesla Powerwall has a 5 kilowatt rated output and a 7 kilowatt burst. So if it has a burst, why do I say that the Tesla Powerwall might be a lower end lithium ion battery compared to the lithium iron phosphate? Well, check this out. I looked at 7 kilowatts divided by 5 kilowatts. The burst rating for the Tesla Powerwall is 40% greater than its rated output. I go look at the SimpliPhi burst rating, 60 divided by 34, and it's a 76% burst rating. So what that means is the Tesla Powerwall, which is not a lithium iron phosphate, it's a lithium ion, it's a lithium something else. Usually when you do a quality lithium ion battery, if it's better than the Tesla Powerwall, you're going to tell the audience what's in it. So lithium iron phosphate's better than the Tesla Powerwall. Lithium titanate is better than the Tesla Powerwall in terms of performance, not necessarily in terms of cost effectiveness. But what we can see is the lithium iron phosphate battery can burst for 10 minutes faster than its 2 hour output rating. That's about twice as much burst capacity as the non-lithium iron phosphate technology as far as mainstream goes. So then we go back and we look at our lithium titanate battery, and we see that it has even more cycles than the lithium iron phosphate, that we can see it delivers even more power per volt than the lithium iron phosphate, that it is more energy dense than lithium iron phosphate. And so, even though it's an emerging technology, just looking at the technical specifications, I can say, well, actually, if I want lithium iron phosphate for the burst rating, let's say I have a weird application where I only need 10 minutes of power and nothing more than that. And you get that kind of situation on electronic server farms, or if there's a power outage, they want 10 minutes of storage capacity before it shuts down. Or you might get that at an industrial facility where at the beginning of the day, all the machines have to start up at the same time, and you get a giant surge for 10 minutes, and that's it. You might want to pay more for a higher performance, longer lasting battery if you uniquely need that 10-minute or half an hour burst. At the same time, there's newer technologies coming to market that are usurping what is thought to be king of the top quality. So lithium iron phosphate is thought of as the top quality on the market, but we are starting to see even higher quality components come to market, like lithium titanate, which is for sale from China if you're wanting to trust buying batteries that way, which many do. And then we get to Kilowatt Labs, which has what they call a supercapacitor on the market, which is effectively a battery that they say it has a million a million cycles on it. They say that you can effectively discharge it almost instantly, like the capacity on your battery. And so that would be a technology that it's not just the burst mode for 10 seconds, but you can truly draw the entire capacity out of it instantly. And what we see is that the better the performance, the more the cycles, the higher the burst capacity, the higher the round trip system efficiency. So here we have the supercapacitor. And remember how the lithium iron phosphate battery was rated for 75% above its normal discharge rate for 10 seconds. Well, this one is rated at 70%, at a one maximum discharge rate of 1.7 C, which implies that basically what you get out of the lithium iron phosphate over 2 hours, you can get out of this supercapacitor in about 20 minutes without the battery burning up or exploding. More than likely, what we're actually talking about is the battery degrading because of the heat. The heat you can't really avoid, and also it being what drives the chemical reactions that degrade the battery chemistry. So lithium iron phosphate is more expensive than lithium ion. Lithium titanate is more expensive than lithium iron phosphate. Lithium titanate's about the same price as this old supercapacitor, which is on the market in Australia. But the problem is, lithium ion is still pretty expensive. So you get into this high end stuff, unless you have like a very niche application, you think, well, where could this make its way? How could we make some of this better technology? How can it come into the job site? And for that, we get back into kind of a discussion of why I use lead acid in the off-grid market. Um, this is a graph of how flooded lead acid degrades at higher rates of discharge. And so often when you get the rating of a flooded lead acid battery, it'll be at its 20-hour discharge rate. Sometimes they'll give you its rating at its like kind of maximum 100-hour discharge rate. But basically, long story short, you can discharge flood lead acid battery and do load leveling with flooded lead acid battery and not have it be over a 20-hour time frame or a 10-hour time frame. Forklift batteries are commonly done on a 6-hour time frame. So if you're trying to load level loads that are 5 or 6 hours long, lead acid may be something you consider. What this graph is showing is by the time you're trying to discharge lead acid at a 2-hour rate, you're just losing, all of your energy to heat. And so where it comes down to is that it's like, well, lead acid is probably the best for baseload operation. Lithium ion is better for peak dynamic swings. Lithium iron phosphate would be even better for more short-term loads like 20-second or 20-minute loads or even a half an hour loads. And then there's new technologies like lithium titanate and supercapacitors that are too expensive for all but specialty applications, but they are on the market. You can buy them, and they will get cheaper because they're so new. What it implies is that you might actually want multiple battery chemistries on the same job site because they all have different roles. I want to make sure that I have enough storage capacity so that I can actually achieve my demand reduction levels, but lithium ion is too expensive by the time I get into load leveling 4 or 5 hour loads, whereas lead acid might be a better choice. Or I might find, as we did with that dentist office, that in the middle of July, there is one 15-minute load that turns on and surges the demand, and all I really need is a highly specialized, instantly dispatchable storage technology to specifically target that. And that might be a better use for lithium iron phosphate or something even more higher end than that. The problem is many of these solutions are not compatible with other battery chemistries. And perhaps some of that is because of good old-fashioned, business tactics of not wanting to support it. But I don't think it's any surprise that the manufacturers of the only supercapacitor that's on the consumer market for solar load leveling, their other kind of specialty is a concept that they call an energy server. I've actually gotten into some smart home design and installation. I'm working on a kind of a higher end home right now for a retiree, and we're installing a home media server. Now, I'm a computer guy. I'm not really a fiber optic guy. But after researching what a home media server does, is it's kind of like a server room for a building, and that, well, sure, there are other ways to go about wiring your internet infrastructure. You could just daisy chain every computer device together with Ethernet cords, but a computer server would take a hodgepodge of different computers and switches and just bring them all into one place and control them more effectively. So we're doing a media server for this retiree, and it brings in all of their, DVDs, their streamable subscriptions, their online downloads, over the antenna, over the air television service, their DVR, their smartphones, their security cameras. It pulls it all into one central processor so that it can be delivered to multiple devices on the home so that you can watch, sports or Netflix on your phone and on your TV, and on any internet connected TV. A home media server organizes it and controls it. And so that's where we're getting into the concept of an energy server, which is basically the control hardware and software that dispatches your energy. And often the lithium ion manufacturers are now providing their own hardware and infrastructure and containers to manage their own products. And a few companies out there are writing hardware to manage multiple battery chemistries and multiple products so that you could use some cheap storage for baseload and premium storage for your spiky peaks, and an ultra capacitor to smooth out any hysteresis, and a lead acid bank to be there for emergency if it looks like you need a little bit more power. It's there to deploy. So all right, so we talked about burst ratings. Here we go. Let's go look at the Tesla Powerwall warranty. So here's the Tesla Powerwall warranty, and we see that it's rated for about a 70% depth of discharge. That's not quite what's going on with the warranty, but we just see that it is a slighter, weaker warranty than, say, the SimpliFee warranty. And let's see, what else do we have for the day before we move on? The main issue with the Tesla Powerwall is it uses cheaper material and is a cheaper battery. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, there is a concept of a starter battery, which is a battery that you kind of use and abuse starting out while you're still gathering kind of data about your facility before you upgrade to a more premium battery. Sometimes on off-grid projects, I'll use a refurbished forklift battery, more for budget regions than anything else. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to kind of end the day providing you with some content that came from someone else. So tomorrow we're going to look at a couple of more models using a software called Energy Toolbase. And so I periodically ask their founder for updates on the battery industry, because he, being a commercial battery software writer and manager, is inundated with that much more than I am out here in Mississippi. So I asked him which of his batteries are most common today. Low-end lithium ion, high-end lithium iron phosphate. And, his response was, he really sees both. Things like the lithium ion low-end, like the Tesla Powerwall, or lithium iron phosphate. He does say they do see activity from flow battery vendors. That really hasn't changed too much from when I talked to him about this 3 years ago. other than the fact that lithium iron phosphate seems to be more commonplace. Let's see. This one we're going to talk about tomorrow. Uh, I came across a solar installer who claimed to know of a project where the AC and DC relationships were way out of range. So we talked about this earlier today, how generally with solar, you're going to oversize the solar array by 120%. So maybe you have a 10 kilowatt array and an 8 kilowatt inverter. Now that you have a battery in between the two, the relationship's kind of broken. And so you can get away with a very small battery and a very large inverter if you want to. In fact, really, the smaller the solar array and the larger the battery and the shorter and spikier the load, the more cost-effective the solar peaker. So I was quite surprised when I came across an installer who claimed to know of what was a 250 kilowatt output on a 48 kilowatt hour input, which would imply that it would only take them 10 minutes or 15 minutes to fully drain the entire battery. And so I thought, well, certainly these guys are going to be like blowing up their low end lithium ion batteries. Well, it turns out they used lithium iron phosphate. And so there is a specific internet application that requires these things, this Horizon farm, server farm, to have 10 minutes and 10 minutes only of backup power capability. And so they really weren't using their solar peaker as a solar peaker plant. You know, what they were using is high-end lithium iron phosphate and a giant inverter to say, you know what, we're going to blow through our entire battery in its 10-minute burst rating, but it's rated for that and it can take it and we can do it. And we're going to talk about that server configuration later on, because the way that this company Delta has designed it is that's kind of their entry level shell, and then after you can take that shell and add more batteries inside of it, and obviously add more solar to it. So they're kind of looking at solar peakers as, you know, let's give someone a small battery and a heavy output and see what the facility can do, and then build on the battery from there. And actually, the COO of Energy Toolbase said he had never heard of any ratio like that before, where you intentionally put a 250 kilowatt inverter on a battery bank that would only last 10 minutes if it got depleted like that. You know, the Tesla Powerwall, in comparison, is designed to discharge over 2.5 hours, not 10 minutes. So his response was he thought the standard was discharge the battery in no more than 1 hour rather than fully discharge it in 10 or 20 minutes. But, you know, what we're seeing is a hard turn towards pushing that limit as much as possible. You know, having a 20 kilowatts of solar on a 100 kilowatt hour battery bank with 50 kilowatts of output is a decent configuration, but it can get more aggressive than that. But that would force you, I would say if you're discharging your battery in under 2 hours, you have to start looking at lithium iron phosphate. This guy from China started to get me thinking about how it's going to be a long time before I can actually go and afford a lithium titanate battery unless I go and buy from China and build my own system. So I asked them if most projects use integrated solutions where the inverter and the software and the battery all come packaged together, or on commercial projects for cost savings reasons, do they divide up the battery purchase from the inverter electronics purchase, and he says the market is split. Perhaps the most useful response I got from him was I asked how they were providing demand management for the facility. Is it just kind of dumb hard coding like we did in our model, or is there more intelligence being applied to demand management? And the reason I ask that is a lot of the battery inverters we use in residential off-grid are in that category of dumb inverters that, as far as load leveling goes, you get 12 months of the year and you can program the thresholds in, but they're not going to do anything more smart than that. And what Energy Toolbase's response was is that there indeed are players in the industry who, I'll put some of their names in the chat if you want to look at them, but indeed there are players in the industry who are focusing on demand management intelligence for battery systems. And then the last question was, I asked him how much of the battery market is operating within California, the subsidy program, because that's the other thing where Energy Toolbase may be a little bit too skewed towards high-end lithium batteries because California chunks in another 30% for the project via state tax credits. And so a lot of the buyers out there are looking for more premium solutions rather than base solutions. But, from talking with, probably one of the, I would say the top solar battery software company in the U.S., he's seen, his indication is that the market is pretty split right now between like LG Chem and Tesla Powerwall style low-end lithium ion, which uses cobalt and has fewer cycles but is less costly, versus these more premium technologies. Okay, so we are at the end of our program. I'm going to